about that because technically it's improper action on the workshop.
Good afternoon. It is 1 p.m. April the 18th, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this Indian River Lagoon workshop. So with that, I'll call this meeting to order. And we'll move on to presentations. Item A, Natural Resource Management Department.
Okay. Good afternoon, Commissioners. We're happy to be here this afternoon. As you'll recall, the board had directed that you wanted a workshop. I think it was back in the December timeframe. Initially, we started talking about it, and then we set it early at the beginning of this year to focus on something that has been a top priority for us in the last couple of years for a variety of reasons, both the Indian River Lagoon and our utilities program. So what we're going to have for you today are two presentations, one done by Virginia and Natural Resources to really give you a brief overview of where they were, where they are, and where they're going in terms of the Indian River Lagoon, Save Our Indian River Lagoon initiative that she's spearheading. And then also, we're going to turn it over to Eddie Fontanen with Utilities to give you an overview of what I believe are very proactive steps that we're in the process of taking, and they have been taking, and then more of what they plan to do moving forward. And you'll see that in a lot of areas, there's some interconnection between the two, potentially. But then there's also other areas where it's primarily a utilities focus, or in Virginia's case, in the Indian River Lagoon, it really has nothing to do with utilities. But we're going to try to cover all that fairly briefly, and then give the opportunity for the public input and comments to the board. And then from there, obviously, we'll be looking forward to any board discussion and direction that you want to provide for how we ought to be moving forward, consistent with or maybe modified from what we present to you today. So with that, let me just turn it over to Virginia, and we can get the show going.
Okay, and I just heard Frank use the word briefly several times. So you saw my slide deck ahead of schedule. I'm not sure it meets the definition of brief.
Yeah, but we both know that there were 4 times as many slides when you gave me the initial version.
Yes,
so
yes, that's very true.
It's
so it's
relatively
briefer
brief
than it could have been. So as an outline, I'm going to start off big picture, what are our clean water goals, then talk about our progress to date, a little bit about projects that are underway, how our adaptive management process happens annually, some opportunities that we're looking forwards to in the next iteration of the plan update, the 2020 plan, potential places to go for matching funds, and then regulatory considerations. So big picture, our clean water goals for the Indian River Lagoon are to get this water body back to where it's fishable, swimmable, harvestable, and provides economic value, wonderful economic value to our community. But these are very difficult to measure, and so we had to come up with targets that we could quantify. So these are the targets in the plan. They relate to water clarity, a sandy bottom to the lagoon, acres of seagrass, dissolves oxygen levels that support healthy fisheries, and then natural filtration systems to help restore the lagoon after acute, episodic, storm-related type events or other disasters. So to do that, we have to understand where pollution is coming from the lagoon, and it comes from many sources, and there's no single one of those sources that is enough to restore the water quality that we want. And so we have to go at this from many angles, and to do that efficiently, we need to understand how much pollution is coming from which of the major sources in the lagoon. So we've taken a historical approach, looking back in time of where did the loading used to come from. And so there's a historical perspective, especially from people who've lived here for several decades or generations, that we put a lot of sewage into the lagoon. We put secondarily treated sewage effluent into the lagoon, and we stopped doing that. Brevard County stopped doing that in the 80s. Then the Indian River Lagoon Act passed in 1990, and the cities also got offline, so they were no longer discharging on a daily basis into the lagoon. And so I'm going to show you how these things have changed. But certainly, if we were back in the 80s, the big focus would be on the point source discharges from our wastewater utilities. And the next highest priority would be stormwater runoff. The county adopted a stormwater utility in 1990, so we've been working on stormwater treatment for nearly 3 decades now, and the cities have been doing similar. So when we go forward to present, you'll see the point source discharges, that left green bar, has come down to a relatively small amount. Meanwhile, our groundwater pollution levels have nearly doubled, our septic pollution levels have nearly doubled, atmospheric deposition, the amount of pollution that falls out of the sky, has decreased about 10% due to clean air emission standards for power plants and vehicles mostly. Stormwater runoff has decreased by nearly 1/3, but muck has increased, has basically doubled,
Virginia,
similar to...
Do you want us to hold questions till the end, or do you want us to ask while you're going?
Your pleasure, it's your
Do you have a
workshop.
preference?
Look to the chair.
No, that's fine. I mean, as long as we continue to move forward. You can ask her.
Yeah, I'm going to let you keep going, but
Oh, okay.
Okay.
yeah, I wanted to
up
kind of
to
get
you.
that out of the way because I anticipate
Okay.
the direction you're going on this. Thanks.
Okay, so as you know, our plan comes at this from 4 different angles, reducing the incoming excess loading of mostly nitrogen and phosphorus, then removing accumulations of nutrients that have been stored into the lagoon and built up over the decades that are now found in large accumulations of decomposing muck. Restoring the filter feeders that provide a natural filtration service to the lagoon, and then responding to new information as we measure our progress, update our costs, look at new technologies, and consider substitute projects through our annual update process. So in terms of project selection, within each of those different project types, each of those sources of pollution, we looked at what are the specific projects, exactly where, what size, which lots could we do, what would be the cost of each of those projects, what would be the benefits of those projects. We came up with a cost-benefit ratio, and within each project type, so within septic to sewer, or within muck, or within wastewater treatment plant upgrades, what would be the most cost-effective projects. And we listed those in the plan. We listed them from most cost-effective to least cost-effective, and then funded the ones that were most cost-effective. But we have a running list of additional project opportunities if additional funds came in.
I do have a quick question about that. With respect to most or least cost-effective, when you look at that, is that based on the amount of nitrogen removed on an annual basis, and is it
Yes.
limited just to that first year, or how do you track that out?
It's based on an annual average. So most of these projects are, you convert septic to sewer, those septic tanks remove, and there's an equilibration period, but after that has worked out, there will no longer be that annual introduction of new nutrients from those septic systems because they're not there anymore. And that same benefit should continue for each year thereafter.
Okay, so just real briefly, if I can, as a follow-up, I'm just trying to figure out how this is accounted for in the plan. If we have, for example, we have 2 different sources of pollution. We have muck, which is fluxing, and then we have, let's say, a leaking gravity main going to a wastewater treatment plant. Obviously, at some point or over a period of time, that muck flux is going to have fluxed everything that's in there that's able to be fluxed, the 1 to 3% organic, at which point it's not going to flux anymore because there's essentially nothing beyond negligible amounts left, whereas with the sewer line, it's not going to get better. The question is, does it stay the same or does it get worse, where that's going to potentially leak or cause the contents to go out in perpetuity or until it's replaced. So I'm curious as to how that's accounted for, because let's say 15 years out or 10 years out, the muck at a certain point is not going to be fluxing any longer. But again, that sewer issue is going to continue going. So I'm just wondering if that's been accounted for, and if not, if there's some reasonably straightforward way where we could not only track it on an annual basis, but we could say project it out over the next 10 or 15 years. I know people don't like hearing that this is going to be a long-term problem to resolve, but in addition to knowing what it's going to do in the first year, I think I would derive some value out of seeing what it would do over 10 or 15 years, maybe a little shorter or a little longer.
So we can look at that for muck flux. If you turned off all the new sources and nothing was going into the lagoon but pure, clean, deionized, whatever water, it would, according to Dr. John Treffery's research, it would take 100 to 200 years for that muck that's already there to stop fluxing. So yes, eventually, as you point out, the muck would reduce, but at this point, we're still putting too much in, so muck is still potentially increasing, and we wouldn't see those decreases for our lifetime or several more generations. On the leaks, obviously, in utilities, those do get worse over time. I would certainly defer to our utilities experts on how we could possibly look at that increasing risk over time, because we've based the cost-benefit analysis on current risk.
Over a one-year period. Yeah, I'm not trying to make your job inordinately difficult by any means, but if it's something that you all are able to put together where we can get a longer projection than 1 year for the impact it'll have on both fronts, I think it may be helpful in determining from a long-term approach what the most cost-effective options are, because it's certainly much better than nothing, and it's great to know over a 1 year period. But over and above that, if it's not going to be inordinately difficult, I'd love to see it tracked out to a much longer-term time frame.
Okay. So we have this portfolio of project types, going after the ones that appear to be the most cost-effective in each project type. And then we also had to look at what is the spatial distribution of those projects. If all of the least cost projects were in one area of a rural county, that would not provide clean water everywhere. And so we had to make sure that we were getting a good spatial distribution of projects in north, south, east, west, but also in terms of the Indian River Lagoon Basin Management Action Plans, the North Indian River Lagoon, the Central Indian River Lagoon, and the Banana River Lagoon. And then we tried to take into account sequential timing. Obviously, it would be ideal if we could stop the incoming pollution before we clean up and remove the muck. We've done that where we could, but because of that 100 to 200 year time on muck flux, we can't wait forever, and it's such a large contributor, we really have to start that now. We can't afford to wait because it will continue to feed blooms. We will continue to be at a high risk of fish kills if we don't start reducing that input as soon as possible. So next I want to take a couple minutes to share some videos. The first one is the most recently completed project. This one was completed by the city of Titusville just a couple weeks ago, and it's the Baffle Box Project. It's about a 1-minute video. Okay. Yep. All right, it worked when Commissioner Glover got here early this morning.
I'll vouch for it did work.
This is the South Street Basin Baffle Box Project for the city of Titusville. A baffle box is a box with a series. This is the South Street Basin Baffle Box Project for the city of Titusville. A baffle box is a box with a series of settling chambers. There's 3 settling chambers within the box. It's placed in line with the stormwater pipe. As the stormwater passes through, the sediment, debris, and trash gets settled into the bottom of these chambers, and then we'll come back with a vacuum truck and remove all of that trash and debris. so that it doesn't enter the lagoon. The debris can consist of leaves, grass clippings, and other things that can get into the lagoon and decompose and release nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are one of the main contributors to the loss of seagrass, and seagrass is important to the habitat and wildlife of the Indian River Lagoon. We have 5 baffle boxes going in this year with the City of Titusville, which are partially funded through the Save Our Indian River Lagoon program. We have 3 within the South Street Basin, another in St. Teresa Basin, and another in the La Paloma Basin. They will all be installed within this fiscal year. Our timeline was increased by being able to get funding through the Save Our Indian River Lagoon plan.
A half-cent sales tax approved by Brevard County voters in 2016 will pump more than $480 million toward restoration of the Indian River Lagoon. But the investment in one of the county's most prized environmental amenities and economic drivers doesn't end there. Other local and state funding in the form of grant dollars is also involved in the improvement project that focuses not only on removal of pollutants that have built up in the lagoon over many decades, but in preventing other pollution sources such as stormwater runoff, septic system effluent, and storm-related sewage backups from tainting the future health of the lagoon. One prime example of how multi-agency partnerships can benefit the lagoon is underway on Merritt Island. It's a multifaceted initiative called the Cone Road Project. This 3-phase effort utilizes financial resources from the Merritt Island Redevelopment Agency, the St. Johns River Water Management District, and the Save Our Indian River Lagoon program. The project phases include conversion of more than 80 commercial and residential properties from outdated septic systems to a new county sanitary sewer system and sewer line, construction of stormwater treatment infrastructure, and a water quality treatment system that will divert untreated stormwater to a treatment pond and denitrification bioreactor. Other features include a sidewalk over the pipe ditch along Cone Road that will improve pedestrian access and vehicle safety, and a sanitary sewer main that will serve more than 60 parcels within the Cone Road industrial area. Upon completion, the Cone Road project will prevent over 3,000 pounds of nitrogen and almost 200 pounds of phosphorus, both cited as major causes of algal blooms, from entering Banana and Indian River lagoons annually. It's also estimated the project will benefit the local economy, generating capital investment and creating additional jobs and strengthening the tax base. With one 3-phase project, these agencies are combining forces, funding, and resources to improve local infrastructure, treating stormwater runoff into the lagoon, improve safety, remove blight, improve property values, and most importantly, preserve the future health of the Indian River Lagoon.
So my thanks to SCG TV staff who worked furiously to get that done in time for this afternoon. That project is under construction right now, and Public Works forces have been constructing part of it. The other part was bid out. So that's, if you want to go see something underway. These projects are complex and they take a long time to deliver, but by coordinating lots of additional benefits, we can make the projects better. So this is a map of projects that are completed, those that are underway, and those that have begun design, engineering, or permitting. So we have 17 completed projects. They're color-coded, which is a little hard to see here, but 4 projects that are under construction right now. We have 8 projects that are in monitoring or being monitored for their performance right now, and 26 projects in design. So when you look at those in terms of the distribution of numbers of projects between the different project types, you can see that the majority of completed projects, 9 have been kinds that reduce incoming pollutant load. And then we have 3, actually it's 2 muck removal projects, one of which also involved interstitial treatment. And then 5 monitoring, 3 oyster bar and 2 living shoreline projects with monitoring complete on 4 projects to date. And then you'll see the columns on the right are projects that have begun or are underway. Because these projects take so long to deliver, the Citizen Oversight Committee asked us if we could develop a tool that would help them see where we are in terms of getting these projects going. So this is a one page of a very long spreadsheet that itemizes every single project that is underway for the plan right now, and shows you at what step in the process it is, and the percent complete, percent that's been billed and paid. And that's also posted on our website monthly. So this is another look at how funds are currently distributed. And I wanted to point out a few things here. So you can see that the distribution of the 10-year costs, there's a slightly more funds spent on reducing incoming load than on removing the legacy load. You can see the relative benefits here of pounds of nitrogen reduction versus pounds of nitrogen being removed. And this number, this number does not include grant funding and other sources of revenue. This is just the Save Our Indian River Lagoon tax portion of project costs. And then what's really significant about this $126 million number is, we were looking at, because these projects take so long to get underway from the time that they're envisioned to the time that they're completed, we've started the design and engineering and permitting on projects for several future years. And so that number of the total value of projects that we've started exceeds today's revenue, because we are trying to head start those projects so they'll be ready to go by the time the dollars are in the bank. So annually, we have our plan updates. It's a responsive process. Based on those performance measures of updating our costs, updating the benefits of our projects annually, looking at new technology or new uses of existing technology, and collecting new project ideas from other departments and from the cities, and looking at those opportunities. All of that goes into annual plan updates. We try to be as transparent as possible through our website, through the Citizens Oversight Committee, and obviously through your county commission meetings as well. Ultimately, those annual updates are brought to you to review, approve, modify, or reject. So I want to just show you one example of some of the performance measuring, monitoring that we're doing. So we installed 45 groundwater sampling wells to represent different community types in the county, natural areas as a control, septic communities, sewer communities, and then sewer communities that also receive reclaimed water. And so just looking at the first two, you'll see what is the nitrogen, the background level of nitrogen in groundwater in Brevard County, below 0.5 milligram per liter. And then in the septic community, it's considerably higher, nearly 6 milligrams per liter. So we select the worst of those septic communities and we convert them to sewer. And so we want to know what's that going to look like after we've done that. And here's the pollution level in sewer communities. Now, this could be leaky sewers, but it's probably a lot of things besides that. Right, the difference between the sewer area and the natural community is that it's occupied. People are living there. It's a residential community. There's fertilizer. There's things dripping out of the car. There are lots of other things happening in addition to the sewer service.
Hopefully an easy question for you. What's the conversion for taking milligrams to liter and then working that out to parts per million?
It's the same number.
Same number? Okay, I just want to make sure I'm looking at this correctly. Thank you.
All right, and so we invest in converting these worst septic communities to sewer service, providing sewer service and getting them hooked up. And then if they happen to be in an area that is receiving reclaimed water, this is the groundwater level in those communities with the highest concentration of nutrients in their reclaimed water. So, we had models that led us to believe that the nutrients in reclaimed water was important. We now have 9 months of groundwater data that demonstrates that the percent of nutrients in that reclaimed water is really important in terms of groundwater pollution. Another thing to note here is that the projects funded with the lagoon tax to upgrade the wastewater treatment plants in terms of pounds of load reduction for the cost invested, those reclaimed water projects are about a third the cost of the septic to sewer conversion costs. So these are a big bang for our buck opportunity. So I want to talk about the kinds of big changes that have happened in the 2019 plan that are part of this adaptive management process. I know you've seen this graphic before. Just everybody, initially the plan was based on the only data that we had, which was estimated distance from the septic drain field to the lagoon or some sort of connected waterway. So just a distance-based estimate of how much of this loading coming out of the drain field was working its way through the groundwater to the lagoon. During development of the septic ordinance that you adopted last summer, we did a lot of modeling and measuring of individual septic tanks, looking at other factors. And so one of the most important factors was not just distance, but also soil type. So the initial plan was just based on lumping all the septic tanks into 3 distance class bins. So using the analysis that was done for the septic ordinance, we took it another step forward. How do we use that information to refine and improve the plan? And so we looked at these 15,000 septic systems that are responsible for nearly 3/4 of the total loading from septic systems in Brevard, and divided them between the ones that are in low conductivity soils, medium conductivity soils, and high conductivity soils. And so 8,000 septic systems out of the 53,000 septic systems in Brevard that drain to the lagoon, those 8,000 of them are responsible for over half of the loading. But then we went another step, and we said, okay, of those 8,000, can we look at a finer distance scale? And so instead of looking at 50 meters or 55 yards, we went in 10-meter slivers, 11-yard slivers, and we see that this 5,600 septic systems are responsible for nearly half of the 400,000 pounds of septic loading to the lagoon annually. So we can zoom in on these septic systems and get significantly reduce the septic loading to the lagoon. The tricky part that this doesn't show is that for this to be cost effective for utilities, these things have to be clustered. They have to be close to each other. And so we also performed a cluster analysis looking for where there were clusters of these highest priority septic together. And we used that to reevaluate all of the projects in the plan. Fortunately, the ones that were in the plan all still ranked high, but we also identified a few more that were added to the plan. Then with the 2019 revision and the board's direction to the Oversight Committee to look for more, we worked with utilities, we identified some additional opportunities, and we added more of those best projects that grab the highest ratio of these super important septic systems and the lowest number of least important septic systems. So once we understand how septic systems impact the groundwater that impacts the lagoon, you start looking at what else works, what else functions the same way. Sorry, I skipped this part. So there are 53,000 tanks, so just over 10% of the tanks are responsible for nearly half of the nitrogen pollution from septic in the lagoon. So if septic tanks and drain fields pollute our groundwater, and we know that reclaimed water, once we distribute it out to neighborhoods, is polluting our groundwater. What about the reclaimed water that's still sitting at the wastewater treatment plant in rapid infiltration basins, which this is a picture of 2 rapid infiltration basins at the Port St. John plant, or spray fields? And so the same processes are happening. That water full of nutrients is infiltrating into the groundwater and moving laterally to the lagoon. And so this 2019 plan update did a cost-benefit analysis on upgrading these water storage areas and added several pilot projects into the plan.
Virginia, as far as the reclaimed water, are we lumping in both the secondarily treated water and the tertiary treated water?
It should be the same number.
It's whatever the effluent is coming out of the plant that's going to.
In terms of the numbers or the graph that we have where you show the relative amount of nitrogen in that community, I'm just wondering if that's coming from a wastewater treatment facility that has additional treatment over and above secondary treatment before they send it out.
That is you're talking about the bar graph?
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry to go back a little.
Yeah, sorry. So we've installed wells in 4 different communities that have reclaimed water. And so that's an average of those 4 communities, some of which have high concentration values and some of which are very close to AWT. This includes the Sun Tree area.
And AWT, I'm just thinking on average would probably be a touch under half that amount of nitrogen?
AWT would have to be under 3 parts per million.
3 parts per million? Okay.
It's 1/10, right? So
So a little under half of the 6 then?
the worst one, the highest concentrations are 29 point something milligrams per liter, and then AWT is 3. So there's a very large discrepancy between the cleanest reclaimed and the dirtiest reclaimed.
So at least if we were talking only about those AWT plants, rather than having the reclaimed water numbers being noticeably higher than the septic system community numbers, we'd be close to half the amount in those communities if we're just talking about those areas that have AWT plants that are treating with tertiary treatment?
Yes.
Okay.
And we have that, we have this data by individual reclaimed area, so
That's
we can
great.
tease that apart.
I appreciate that.
I was cutting slides. I was lumping stuff as best I could.
I appreciate it,
And
thanks.
are we going to do further testing on those, like on additional reclaimed water sites?
Yes.
Just so we can get a
Yeah.
good,
Yes.
like a solid average? Because 29's scary.
That's based on the reports that the facility provides to DEP. That they have to take regular samples. So
So that's an easy number to get then.
Yes.
It has to be reported monthly.
That's awesome. Okay, great.
And this one. All right, so that was how we reprioritized and refined the septic portion of the plan and the wastewater treatment opportunities in the plan. We also did a big revision on muck prioritization based on research conducted by the Florida Tech Indian River Lagoon Research Institute over the last couple years. And so they went out to all of the sites that the Water Management District had mapped as potential muck areas to verify, is this really muck? How deep is the muck? How wide is the muck? And they went out with a standard sampling equipment, which is a 20-foot pole. And they experienced muck that was deeper than their 20-foot pole. So they had to go back out with a 30-foot pole to collect information in those sites where the muck was deeper than the 20-foot probe allowed data collection. And then in addition to that, they collected sediment samples, which were taken back to the lab to look at the organic content and the degree to which that organic content was decomposing and releasing or fluxing nutrients into the water column above. So with all of that information, we were able to reprioritize the muck sites in the plan, zoom in on those that are contributing the most nutrients to the lagoon, refine our cost estimates, and reduce the amount being spent on muck dredging by, and with your assistance, by $91 million. And then nearly half of that was invested in adding interstitial treatment to most of the projects in the plan, which was not included in the original 2016 version of the plan. So Annual plan updates take all of those sorts of information into account. We also refine our revenue projections. We update the costs and benefits. We've applied a CPI to annual construction costs, and we collect substitution projects from the community. So as an example of the revenue, this is all 3 fiscal years of revenue. So this was our first year, and the lowest line on there was at the time the tax was adopted, we looked at what the school board had estimated for their half-cent sales tax that had passed just prior. They had estimated $32 million a year revenue. We estimated $34 million a year revenue, and then when the collections started coming in, they were considerably higher than that. So at the end of that first fiscal year, we revised our revenue projection to about $46 million a year with a CPI included. And so what you see here is last fiscal year. The green dotted line is the state's revenue projection. We have been more conservative than the state, and that's a good thing, because otherwise we'd be expecting money that isn't actually coming in. So the blue line, there we go. The blue line is our revised revenue projection, and the purple line right on top of it are our actual collections. So you'll see that even this year, we're right on target. Our collections are right on target with our revised revenue collections. So I was curious. I wanted to go back to compare what was just adopted by the board at your last meeting to the original 2016 plan, and what are all the changes that have been made through investigating more opportunities and digging into the data. And you see significant increases in investment in wastewater projects, stormwater projects, and then this shift from a decrease in muck removal with a shift to interstitial water treatment. So going forward and looking towards the 2020 plan update, we continue to work with utilities. We have regular meetings now looking for additional opportunities for septic to sewer and other related projects. We've also been looking at whether some of the old, outdated, privately owned package treatment plants out there, whether it would make sense to connect them to our sewer service, which provides a much higher level of treatment. We're trying to get that data from DEP. That database is not as ripe with data as we had hoped. We may have to collect some field data to analyze that ourselves. If we can't connect them to sewer because the capacity is not there, or the distance is too great, or some other factor, we may be able to upgrade those package plants in place. We've been working with let me back up, last July, at the same time that you were looking at the septic ordinance, the Department of Health, the state of Florida adopted new measures, a passive performance system for septic projects, an alternative to conventional septic. It was based on a single media type using mulch. There are media out there that should perform better and or last longer, but they have not been tested in the state of Florida to meet the Department of Health testing criteria. So we've been working with the Department of Health to understand what those criteria are and negotiate a memorandum of agreement where if we install and test these systems here, they will accept that data and accept those media types as a system that can be permitted in the state of Florida. So we are in the final reviews of that MOA and are looking forward to bringing that opportunity to you.
Just a question on the media. Is most of what you're looking at media that doesn't require much in the way of human intervention to keep clean, or is it a mixture, or what are we talking about generally?
So this is underneath the drain field, and ideally you want to install it and forget about it for the most part. So what is permitted right now in the state of Florida is a wood chip mixture which may break down over time. And so we are looking at media types that would have a 50-year lifespan instead of a 10-year lifespan.
Ceramics and plastics?
Ceramics and clays and
Okay,
carbon sources.
thank you.
Yes. Surface water remediation, this is something where, every week or two you read another article. They're looking at surface water remediation technologies for the blue-green algae blooms in Lake Okeechobee, Blue Cypress Lake, Lake Apopka, Lake Jessup, and those technologies are all being rapidly developed for freshwater systems. They have not been tested in a saline environment. But we've been looking at those systems that have the most promise in freshwater systems, talking to their developers and investors about whether they would be interested in testing their technology in an estuarine environment, and we hope to have some of those opportunities in the future. Then the last thing is that right now the state is updating the Indian River Lagoon Basin Management Action Plans throughout Brevard and Indian River County, and we've been working with them on updating the stormwater information that goes into those plans. We want to use that same information that we've been working with them on for their updates to refine the lagoon plan like we have done with the septic improvements and the muck research. So hopefully we will have that for the 2020 update. It sort of depends on the state's timing and process as well. It might be 2021. Leveraging potential. Obviously, it would be great to use this lagoon surtax to leverage other funding sources. We have been doing that so far, mostly with municipal and utility cost share. We've also done a few projects with community redevelopment districts, the Myra project, which you just saw featured along Cone Road, the Bayfront Stormwater Pond in Palm Bay. We're now looking in the O'Galley area for a stormwater project. So we're hoping to, if those districts continue and they have funds, that might be a way to help the lagoon. We also continue to apply for grants, and we've gotten a few. We are currently, Tuesday, you'll have a request to submit a grant to Florida Inland Navigation District. This is grant season. A lot of these agencies, their grants are due in this April timeframe. So we're feverishly writing lots of grant applications right now. And then you're well aware of the legislative appropriation process that's going on right now, so we're still hopeful that some of these projects that we've submitted for cost share will come up with some state appropriations. So this is the last slide. Just wanted to leave you with some regulatory options to consider that would complement either what the Lagoon program, the Save Our Indian River Lagoon program is doing, or what Utilities is doing. And I believe that Utilities has some additional options for consideration. So the first one, the fertilizer signs at retail outlets. We really want to help citizens choose wisely when they're purchasing fertilizer at retail outlets. And so several of you have contacted us about this. We have legislative intent coming to you on Tuesday to propose a signage, a notification to consumers ordinance. We have our existing fertilizer ordinance. The board had previously directed staff to, when we got calls or complaints about compliance, to go out and educate, not to enforce. And so the fertilizer ordinance was adopted in 2013. People have had a while to get used to what those rules are. It may be time to consider whether you want staff to do some enforcement. Irrigation restrictions, especially in reclaimed water areas where that reclaimed water has a lot of nutrients in it, and where it's free and it's not metered. People think more is better, and they are using too much of it. And you see it sprayed onto the streets and onto the sidewalks, on all sorts of paved surfaces where it's not watering anything that needs water, and it's actually creating stormwater runoff, and those nutrients are going into the lagoon. The Water Management District has irrigation restrictions that they encourage local governments to adopt. If local governments do that, when you apply for grants from the Water Management District, you get additional points, ranking points, that make your grant application rank higher than if you don't have that local ordinance. For septic to sewer projects, we're either installing gravity lines or force mains, depending on site conditions. And the state law currently requires, once you install a gravity system, people adjacent to that line have 365 days to connect. If you install a force main, there's no requirement to connect. So one thing you may want to consider is whether you want to mandate that when we install, when a gravity system is not feasible for whatever reason, when we install a force main, do you want to require people to connect? As you know, in the Satellite Beach area with the overflows, there was smoke testing done. We identified leaks in the privately owned laterals that connect the homes to the publicly owned utility. While people should make those repairs, and there are rules that say they cannot allow anything other than sewage into those pipes, the enforcement mechanisms currently are very difficult to deal with, and so that's something that you may want to grapple with, that I'm sure utilities knows much more about than I do. As backup to that, we identified through the smoke testing, there were 30 properties that were identified with leaky laterals. We initially did a certified mailing to those 30 people saying, we have a grants program, we'd like to help you get your repair, we need to monitor your groundwater to be able to measure the improvement that happens when this occurs. Out of the 30 letters that were mailed, we had 3 people say yes.
I think 4.
We had initially 3 people that said yes. So we then developed, Frank, can we pass out? We then developed, working with our consultant, developed this brochure, and the consultant has been going door to door on nights and weekends and days, trying to explain the benefits of this program and enlist people to let us help them help the lagoon. And so through that effort, we now have 6 more people who are interested. They haven't signed the dotted line yet, but are interested. So through all of that effort, we still only have 9 of 30 that are potentially interested. So that's why we put on here, do you want to look at the enforcement mechanism for how to make these repairs mandatory? Another option, we talked about this under irrigation restrictions. One way to address over excess irrigation is through conservation rates. So right now, your reclaimed water is free. One way that other communities address the waste issue is by setting a standard home, growing St. Augustine sod, irrigating the amount to keep that sod happy, but no more than that, would use so many inches of water. And so you can calculate a volume for a typical size house, and that could continue to be free as it is now. But for homes that use more than that, you could establish a rate. And that would discourage, and this has worked in many other places, that would discourage people from thinking more is better and from using more just because it's free. It would also establish a potential revenue source for managing that program and enforcing those irrigation rules. Last, and I just added this bullet today based on what's going on in Tallahassee right now. Senator Mayfield has Senate Bill 1278 that would establish a ban on the placement of Class B biosolids on land that seasonally the high water table comes up to the surface and interacts with where those biosolids are being placed, right? Potentially washing those biosolids off the land into whatever adjacent water course. There was House Bill 405 that had matching language. Tuesday, the House bill language was brought into a bigger bill that does a lot of things, House Bill 973. And the timeline for making those requirements was adjusted from July of 2020, so next year, to July of 2022. So what that means, if that current House bill language is approved and makes it through conference or whatever, that the state would continue to permit people to spread Class B biosolids on land that is underwater during the wet season. Right now, that is only a concern to us in the St. Johns River Basin. We have 2 agricultural interests spreading biosolids in Brevard County, but there's nothing to stop ag interests in the Indian River Lagoon Basin from applying for permits from DEP and DEP approving those. And that's if these bills are passed. Otherwise, the state has no reason not to continue to permit this application of biosolids on lands that are significantly connected and polluting our water. So with that happy note, I've made it to questions. Yes.
Is that Robin's photo?
Yes.
Good job. Well done.
Or do you want Eddie to go?
If you want, we can move right into Eddie's presentation so you can hear that information, and then maybe you, so how do we do that, Eddie?
Yes?
Let me get you to Eddie's slides.
We ready?
Ready, if you
All
are.
right. Hi, everyone. So as Frank introduced in the beginning, you've just heard the natural resource size as it pertains to how it impacts the Indian River Lagoon and their perspective. And now I'm going to dive into how utility services perspective and the overlay as initiatives and efforts and services we provide that also have an impact. I always love starting off these presentations because I always like to say we are a department that's 365 days, 24 hours, 7 days a week. So just letting you know. All right. So with that being said, here's the overlay, and this is kind of in big food group perspective as it relates to a utility. When we talk about the Indian River Lagoon, our number one objective is always to reduce, we call it reduce inflow and infiltration, but that's really the biggest culprit as it comes to the discharge and as you know of what occurred in the years past. And there's a lot of components associated with that, and we'll obviously dive more into that. When you deal with operations maintenance, there's what's called preventative maintenance and corrective maintenance. And corrective maintenance, to put it into perspective, is you don't fix your car until it breaks. Preventative maintenance is to have a program to make sure you're keeping up with the maintenance so you don't have to spend money on fixing those items. Because when an item breaks, there's obviously a malfunction in our system that we don't want to occur. So in our department, we put an emphasis on preventative maintenance. And, we talk about valve exercise. Valve exercise is an excellent example of preventative maintenance because on a routine basis, and we try to do this 2-3 times a year per valve, is it gives our staff an opportunity to make sure that everything's working operational. And if it's not, we can identify it and fix it when it's not 5 inches of rain going on, or we'd like to. Lift station inspections, again, fall under that whole thing. Lift stations are our heart and how we pump flow. When a lift station doesn't work, obviously the heart doesn't pump, and again, we fall back to the first bullet, which is, reducing I&I and how those two connect. And the last item with regard to that, and there's several that could have been put under this category, is sewer assessment. As I talked about in the budget presentation, we are now actively beginning a sewer assessment. And again, it falls under the line of doing preventative maintenance, going out there, checking all of our assets. And again, an asset can be a valve, a sewer, a lift station, and anything that we take jurisdiction of. And basically finding out what needs improvements, developing a program, developing a budget around that program, and initiating it. And we talk about reducing nitrogen in reclaimed water. So obviously, as Virginia pointed out, when nitrogen is too high in a facility and the runoff gets into the canals and lakes and whatnot, that has a detrimental effect. So, and we'll dive, again, I have my share of slides. I don't know if I have as much as Virginia, but I do have a few. But we'll talk about what we're doing with that regard.
And before you go on, go back to the
Sure.
prior slide, because I want to focus on the preventive maintenance. That, while we've had some preventive maintenance program in the past, that's being reanalyzed and has been reanalyzed just this year, when Eddie came on board just a few months, well, several months ago, but took over as the director. And so when you talk about that valve exercise program, it sounds like we've been doing that forever, but that's not the case. He is in the process of hiring, I believe, 11. Yeah, he tried to even get more than that, but 11 additional positions to be able to do that. One of the reasons we knew it was very important is because of the issues about, hey, if you ever have a spill, how do you prevent it from being even larger than it otherwise would be? And one of the potential problems that, when we looked at that was that, hey, if you've got valves that are a problem, then you've got to go down further the line to find the problem, et cetera. So having that kind of valve exercise program is in place. And he needed the staff to be able to do that so he could get to them, because I don't know how many valves you have, but there are
Several,
several hundred of them.
But to add on what
Yeah.
Frank's saying and the reason of preventative maintenance, there's industry standard of what the expectation is. There's a level of service with regard to preventative maintenance. And as you all know, Brevard County is growing. And as subdivisions grow, we take on more jurisdiction of water and sewer and reclaimed water. So in going through that analysis and comparing where our staff level was, Frank's been more than cooperative to allocate or allow us to have more of those positions so that we can be more robust on that.
And then that goes for the lift stations as well. And there's mechanics coming online. So what I wanted to emphasize for the board is they've undertaken an initiative, and you'll see that. So as we get into the budget process, why is utilities, full-time staff increasing by, probably 12 to 15, maybe even a few more than that over time, but they're doing that now. And that's because to be able to appropriately address the valve exercise program, lift stations, and then what needs to be done at the plants to make sure, he needed the staff to do that. And we have for a long time organizationally been trying to reduce. So there were cuts in the past that, perhaps at this point, in light of the focus that's been out there for a number of years on infrastructure improvements and deferred maintenance things, we're trying to make sure not only that we catch up, but that we avoid problems that, have occurred in the past that we're in a position to do better on moving forward. And I think that's a big part of what this slide was, and his sales pitch as to why we needed the additional positions.
Okay, so again, for the benefit of this workshop, we're talking about, from the utilities perspective of opportunities with soil, and obviously I'll be giving you the perspective as it relates to a utility. And again, in no particular order, but we have a lot of septic tanks in Brevard County, and we need to start looking at regionally, not just how do we get 10 online, but regionally, how do we get areas online? Because, from a utility perspective, you can associate that almost from like a traffic perspective, is you don't build a road to accommodate 10 people, you build a road to accommodate a region. And we take that same approach because when we go through and we do the infrastructure and we're digging that hole, we try to really do as much due diligence as we can to make sure that size of line is appropriate, not only for the present, for the future. So, the more we get into the septic to sewer, it's more on the regional and how we can get large clusters tied in. Connecting private package plants to the county system. So, once upon a time, the utility services was a few package plants, and along the way, Barefoot Bay is a good example, MIMS, Port St. John is a good example, is they were private package plants. And they were functioning fine, and obviously for whatever reason, whoever operated or the HOA decided that they either didn't want the private entity running the facility, or they were so out of compliance that through a judge's rule, it got turned over to the utilities. And so with that, it's the equivalent of you run in your car down into the ground and then you hand in your keys over to your favorite sibling and say it's yours. And you got to put the investment into it. So from our perspective, we recognize that whether it's today or 20 years from now, there's going to be a probability where some of these private package plants are going to fall into that circumstance because, again, their revenue is very restricted to a small number of customers. So, if there's opportunities where we can get those package plants converted over to the system when they're still in ample good shape, it's less dollars that we have to take and reinvest into it. We talk about reducing nitrogen and reclaimed water. We do have some facilities, and I'll dive into that more in another slide, where we do rapid infiltration basin and spray fields. And we'll talk more about, plant capacity and what the approach is on that. And we talk about smoke testing. And again, it's not just the lateral line, which the lateral line is actually the responsibility of the homeowner, but it's also, I don't know if you've ever seen, it's either next to your house or in the middle of the lawn, but you have a cap. And it's like a $5 or $8 item you can get at any hardware store, but a lot of those caps are missing. Some of them use it as a place to drain their ponded area in their house. Sometimes it gets clipped by a lawnmower. But going back to the previous slide, we talked about reducing infiltration. When lateral lines have cracks, when caps aren't in place, that becomes a point source now where we're introducing rainwater into our collection system. That then becomes a component to having to do discharge because the capacity of our lines, as they were designed, it's no longer efficient, and thus we have a surcharge effect.
Any question on that,
Yes.
if I may? With respect to the smoke testing, it was my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong if you would, that there were actually dollars available for the folks that were inclined to fix those leaky laterals, and what's more, they could have picked their own plumber and gotten reimbursed, so it's not even that they have to pick the people of our choosing. Is that your understanding as well?
That was a program conducted through Sorrel, so if you don't mind.
So that was our intent. The problem is that the consultant, had boxes of caps in the truck as they were going along, and if they could just screw the inexpensive cap on and problem solved, they did that. Many of the vertical pipes that the cap screws onto were also broken and needed repair, but we don't know which ones those were. So we're trying to collect that information so that we can offer that grant program.
So were they smoke tested with the caps off in some cases?
The caps may have been off. It was the smoke testing that identified that a cap was
That the
missing.
cap was missing. But then they had to look at why was the cap missing.
Okay, thank you.
Sometimes a cap is missing because a lawnmower hit it in the process of damaging the cap. It also damaged the pipe that connects to the pipe that the cap screws into. So if it was just the cap that was damaged, it could be replaced.
And that's
It's very
probably the
simple, easy.
biggest cost. You know, I
Yeah, a
can't-
lot,
Twice in 10 years, we've damaged ours and had to replace it. I mean, it's an easy,
It's an easy thing if you only damage the cap. If you damage more than the cap, then it's a little bit more difficult.
and a lot of it is associated, and again, none of it is on purpose, but when you have a lawn service, and they have those heavy standing riding lawnmowers, and if the ground is soft, obviously the blade goes down a little further and it gets cut in that fashion, and it's common.
and so the consultant just neglected to give you the addresses? Is that what happened?
We're seeing if we can rehabilitate that
Yeah,
situation.
we're
Let's not use them again, if that's the
Second.
case. It's pretty important
Very
piece of information
And
to
when we
not
do it next
provide.
time, any future smoke testing we'll be doing, it'll all be GPSed, and we've already consulted with the county survey department that has the ability to do so. And again, I've gone through smoke testing programs, and GPS is the best map that you can ever have, so that will be addressed.
Awesome.
Okay, so kind of hitting this a little bit one by one. We talked about septic to sewer and what are the benefits. Well, I think there's no argument that septic to sewer is a benefit in terms of reducing the nutrients that ultimately get discharged into canals and bodies of water. So I'm not going to overemphasize on that. The other advantage when it comes to septic, or when you do septic to sewer, is from a land use perspective, it gives you more opportunities of what that land can be used. So if you have a district that obviously has a big parcel of land and there's no water or sewer, there's really not a lot you can do short of maybe a tree farm or something of that nature. So, again, from a utility person, water and sewer gives us that flexibility to have different dynamics of what that land can be zoned for and implemented. But as any benefit, there's a con, and, the first thing is the second you're connected onto a system, you're associated with the monthly bill. So I didn't want to hide from that component. It is a burden on us, as Frank was mentioning about the new employees that we've been allocated. As our system grows, in order to maintain that same level of service for preventative maintenance, staff will have to climb up with that. But again, it's not like one person per subdivision. A person can absorb a lot of area, but just to kind of throw that out there. And then there's always the component that you have to also look at your plant capacity. If your treatment plant that ultimately where all this flow comes into doesn't have the capacity to it, then obviously you can't do the septic to sewer, so the two fall hand in hand.
Eddie, I know at least in D2 that we don't have any capacity issues either with the municipal systems or the county system. What about in the other districts? Are any of them teetering close to capacity?
Yes, and if to answer your question bluntly, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Capacity is. We are going through some due diligence that I will touch on that, and if you want to dive into that of what the due diligence is, when you see it and I
Thanks.
talk about it, please let me know.
Appreciate it.
We talked about connecting private package plants to the county system. And again, it's not to say that the people that are running those private package plants are doing a bad job. It's just, when the trend that the county has seen, the Brevard County utilities became in effect, I believe, in 1966. And if you look at that trend, the trend of package plants being incorporated as part of the county it's evident the data is there. So again, we look at it that if those plants were a part of our system, we do have a greater control in not only the operation, but also in, future on discharge and possibly do an AWT on those flows. And we have a very robust, not only team and utilities in the field, but we have programs and we have standard operating procedures. And we feel that from an operations and maintenance, we know what we're doing and we can incorporate that to other components. Again, unfortunately, when you say that, when you throw these ideas out, dollars is always a component. So, it's the cost that it would take to convert those private package plants to the system. And it's not just the cost within the jurisdiction or the HOA, but, given the length of Brevard County, it's the investment of running a line for where these package plants are to connecting them into our existing utility. And again, that could be a mile or two or whatnot, but there is a cost. And it is a cost that, as I keep going back to keep that level of service of maintenance, we do as a department have to budget for that cost. So we talk about water, reducing nitrogen on reclaimed water. So, again, as Virginia pointed out, when we have less nitrogen in our reclaimed water, we have less nutrients that are running off into the ground or into the canals. The good news, a lot of our plants, the majority of our plants are AWT, so we do have a low nitrogen levels. We are under the 3 part per million. But it also gives an opportunity that when we reduce the nitrogen, it takes the reluctance off of the lawn from needing that. And I say that because St. Augustine grass it's actually a hardy grass, but if you spoil it in the sense of overwatering or over-fertilizing it, it actually gets dependent on it. And it almost becomes like a drug for it, and it doesn't know how else to function. So the idea of it is that if we can do that and then encompass that with, lowering how much irrigation we do, we can get this grass levels to a point and possibly reduce the fertilizer need that would be associated with this grass. Again, the cons are it's always money. It's the investment to making sure that all of our treatment plants have low nitrogen, whether it's AWT or a level just above AWT, but to get that investment to do so and the costs associated. So we talked a little bit about smoke testing, and again, the number one reason to me why I love smoke testing is it's an excellent way of identifying point sources on private property that ultimately feed into our system. It's a great opportunity to discourage or identify points where we can identify possible wet weather discharge events. We're not just talking about the smoke testing identifies cracks mainly in the laterals, but it also, in small circumstances, identify cracks in the sewer. But we'll, again, when we talk about the sewer assessment, where we go through that and the grading, that's really where we capture the identifying of failures in sewers. The con about it is it's really not a costly program to do smoke testing. It's actually relative speaking, it's actually cheap. But the difficulty is that a lateral is on private property. So when we talk about like GPS or cataloging these events, now you're getting into the getting on the private property. I will say 99% of the people are very receptive to it, but you get that 1% that says get off of my property, obviously. And then we talk about the regulatory compliance. There really isn't a law or an ordinance that says if your lateral is broke, you have to fix it. There's no mechanism. And unfortunately, sometimes if we don't have those kind of measures, people won't voluntarily just do it. And again, it falls into the mandate for repair. So as we talk about it, whether it's coincidentally or intentionally, but utilities do have initiatives that are underway that we're doing. And again, a lot of it falls back to the slide of the minimizing I&I and the PMs and the reclaim. But, from our point of it, we are doing the sewer assessment. That was something the commission saw on an agenda a month or so ago, where we did the budget transfer in order to do so. This is going to be a program, fiscal year 19, We are doing, assessing the remainder of the beaches in Barefoot Bay. Fiscal year 20, if all works out, we'll be doing, Merritt Island and Port St. John. And the reason for that is it's not by drawing names out of a hat, but we are really trying to identify areas where we did have discharge events, or there's a likelihood, as Virginia talked about the proximity of open bodies of water, and I think there's no arguing that Merritt Island falls into that with canals and whatnot. And again, obviously, we're not going to be done in fiscal year 20. Our plan is to continue that until all of it is done. So obviously, we'll be doing the Vieira Sun Tree area and the others. Lift station improvements. In fiscal year 13-14, the commission approved a rate increase to do an aggressive program in order to do improvements to our existing assets. And we're continuing on that. And the benefit of that is that we are taking lift stations that are 20, 30 years old, putting the investment in it, and to get another 20, 30 years. And every year we are doing, 10, 12, maybe more a year in that regard. So it's important for us to do that. Force main replacement and expansion. You can have a great heart, but if your veins and arteries aren't intact, obviously that becomes a discharge event. So, we're focusing holistically on our system, all with the goal of how do we minimize discharge and treatment plant capacity. And Commissioner Lober, this falls in line. These are the bullets that I wanted to point out to you. So. No, the question that you asked previously are, do any of our plants, and if I phrase it correctly, please correct me, but do any of our plants, are we near capacity? And the answer is yes. Again, in the same report that Virginia talks about that all of our treatment plants have to submit monthly to the FDEP, it's a requirement that identifies not only nitrogens and whatnot, but we also have to say what the flow level is. And the FDEP also understands what our capacity is, and when we get to above an 80%, that becomes a measure where the DEP starts to monitor more closely. We are, on a few of these we are. So, we take the approach, we talked about the reclaimed water and the reduction of nitrogen, and when we do that, do we do the investment on the nitrogen to reduce the nitrogen on a plant that may need more capacity 3-4 years down the line, and is that the best dollars spent? Or do we really make a decision to say we need a new plant, and as part of the funding of that plant, that the SORL dollars in order to do the nitrogen reduction can be used as a part of that? So I tend to overuse this word, but I believe in it. So we are doing our due diligence on this. And the first thing that we're doing is we're doing a population projection analysis. And this is a collaboration that Utilities is doing with our planning department. And it's really a function of trying to find a crystal glass that'll give us our data of what we have current in our projection, and really trying to get an idea of what the shape of Brevard County is going to be from a land development side. We look at areas, obviously Vieira's building out and they've been pretty clear on what they're doing, but if we look at areas, down in North and South Brevard, right now we see a lot of empty land. The question is, in 5 or 10 years, is that land going to still be empty? And if it's not, we need to plan ahead of time to make sure that we have the ability to provide the water and sewer, so that if things are more than just 3-acre lots with a septic tank and a well, we need to be in that position to plan for it. And in the meantime, we're also looking on a short-term basis that on the plants that we do have capacity issue, we have engineering studies going on those plants on what is our options in order to expand the plant capacity, obviously looking at the feasibility of it, to accommodate current development that may be wanting to come in now, but it may be problematic or logistically limited due to our capacity. So we're going through that. I'm sorry, Commissioner Lobert, does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank
Okay.
you.
So when we talk about sewer lining and assessment, we're, if I had a pie graph of what size of pipes that we have, we look at that our 8, 10, and 12-inch are by far the great majority of our gravity system. And so that's really going to be our focus. And, from fiscal year 13, 14 to current, we've lined 69 miles of gravity sewer. And when you associate that, it works out to about $185,000 per mile. So it's not a cheap initiative. However, when you do line a sewer, you get a 30, 40, sometimes 50-year lifespan out of that sewer. So, if you're into cost payback, the cost payback there, it just sucks because you have to pay that initial capital to get there. And if we did take a program that we said, well, let's just not assess anything, let's just go and line every sewer we have, whether we think it's good or bad, that would be about another 490 miles, and that's about an additional $90 million. So again, it goes back to, to assess a line cost about 80 cents to $1 a foot versus doing so. If you do that, so for $5,000 we can assess a line in lieu of just spending $185,000 and blindly going into it. So that's why this kind of gives you the dollars of why our approach is what it is. Fiscal year 18-19, so as we talked about the South Beaches and Barefoot Bay, we are in the program that will be complete by the end of this fiscal year. We'll be assessing 150 miles of sewer. So again, we talk about the benefits. It's identifying critical areas and getting more bang for our buck. It's developing a program to focus on the worst leaks. We use a national grading system, and that grading system is going to be the tool and the measure of what we line in the future. So as we talk about lift stations, or I like to refer to the heart of our collection system, it's, again, I made reference back in fiscal year 13-14. So since then, 40 lift stations have been rehabilitated, 11 lift stations have been reconstructed, 8 lift stations are currently in the process of going through that same process. It's in near design completion mode. And again, we're looking at adding an additional 7 lift stations in fiscal year, 7 lift stations are in rehabilitation now and 8 are in design. So we're looking at a pool of 15 additional lift stations in this current fiscal year that we are drawing attention to get them repaired. Again, none of these lift stations, when we go through this, when we consider the engineering and the construction cost, I'd love to say it's 2-figure projects, but they're 3-figure. On average, they're about $750,000 in investment. Again, we do the preventative maintenance after we get these, we can get the 20, 30-year life out of it. Lift station generators, so, unfortunately FPL is not always going to be there for us, whether it's a brownout or whether it's going to be a hurricane situation. And so of our system, we have 297 lift stations. 20 of them have generators, and those 20 are based on what the requirement at FDEP was at the time of them being permitted. And out of that, 20 were classified as a repump station. Those 20 have. In addition to that, we also have in our fleet 35 portable generators, which means when an emergency comes up, and it's not always a hurricane, but a power outage, or it could even be something regionally in that area, we have 35 portable generators that we mobilize and can get it there within 30-minute time. So as we talked about, all of our lift stations are grandfathered through the FDEP. However, when we talk about the new standard that the DEP has in reclassifying what a repump station, we've identified 13 additional lift stations. Those 13 lift stations will be programmed in fiscal year 20 to be addressed. And again, The cost to install generators on a per lift station basis is approximately $175,000. But it gives us that certainty that when a power does, when the FPL does cut out, we have the ability at major lift stations so that we can minimize the probability of a discharge event. And as the last bullet prevents, and again, it's a reoccurring theme, preventative maintenance is a big component to this.
And you want to mention about Satellite Beach and our partnership with them as far as helping with the generators?
Oh, that's right. This is with the building department?
The Satellite
Public
Beach.
Works?
Well, yeah, Satellite Beach helped us. One of the problems that we have with portable generators and trying to run generators that don't have permanent standby generators sitting there is that you have to have manpower fueling and servicing the generators, and if you leave one there, there's another one that doesn't have one at all, and so you need to move it. So and moving them around and reestablishing them and getting them operational at a new location takes a lot of manpower, a lot of coordination, and we did get some help from some cities on that, particularly Satellite Beach was very helpful with that.
Especially after last year, as we reevaluated what things could we do better, and, they very much came to the table and said, hey, how can we be helping the county and county utilities? So that is something that has occurred within the last 12 to 18 months. So we appreciate that partnership, and that helps us in these areas.
So we talk about force main, not only the replacement, but the expansion. So since fiscal year 13-14, we've replaced 14 miles of force main. And to put that into a cost perspective, per mile, that's about a construction cost of $1 to $3 million. It's $1 to $3 million because it depends on the proximity, the amount of traffic, and what's already in the ground. So, but again, those are, gives you an order of magnitude of the cost. 5 miles of expansion have occurred. Some of that has been through development. Some of that has been through our initiative, anticipating further growth. The North Courtney force main on Phase 2 is one of those examples. And we have some ideas of where we're trying to plan for the future. So we talk about some of the expansion we've done with the Phase 2 at Courtney. Well, we're in the process of the design for the Phase 3 of Courtney because we view that the requests for connection to sewer in the North Merritt Island area are increasing enough that at a minimum we're looking at getting the design, at least have it ready. If there's opportunity for shovel-ready plans through funding, we plan on pursuing that, but we are programming that in our 5-year CIP. Riverside Force Main, this is over on the beaches. This is south of O'Galley, and this is the 3-mile replacement, and this was part of our consent decree. We have to have this project completed as part of the consent in December of 2020. And the $12 million, that was the agenda item that I think we had in the last commission meeting, allowing Frank to sign on the state revolving fund applications. And currently, and this is a collaboration we're doing with Sorrel Funding, is the MECO Force Main. That project is also in design. So, touching a little bit about what Virginia talked about with septic to sewer. So, yes, Brevard County Utilities Department has projects in the Sorrel plan for septic to sewer. Right now, there's 13 of them. And Virginia, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a, I don't know if it's a formula or an if-then, but it's, Sorrel looks at a septic to sewer if the project can get a nitrogen reduction for less than $1,500 per pounds of nutrient removed, they will contribute $33,000 per unit for the construction.
Right, 1,500 per pound is the maximum in the plan.
Okay, so that kind of, and hold tight with that because I'll lead into this, but it's an important point. I don't know if the map, provides justice, but, this is simply a map illustrating on the current soil plan where those 13 projects are located. But in addition to the 13 projects, we also have 22 other areas that aren't identified on that map that are currently unfunded. So we go back to the slide of what we talked about, the if-then related to the funding mechanism of septic to sewer will soil. But again, we look at our logistics as a utility department and how does that function? With that criteria, 2 of the 13 projects meet the soil criteria. 11 of the 13 do not have enough funding if soil is the full source of money to do these projects. 11 of the 13 do not have sufficient funding to take it to completion. And what I've referred to as completion is design and construction. There's enough money for the design of these projects. I don't question that. I think it's when we get to construction we have a shortage. And when we talk about that, the order of magnitude on those, when we talk about the gap of how much more is needed, it's in the range of $380,000 to $2.8 million. And again, a lot of that has to do with proximity and logistics to connecting it to our system, or just what kind of environment that those current projects are being conducted in. So I bring this slide not because I'm campaigning for the number, but I like to use what I call the 50% rule. Is if the program, if it was always taught to me, well, if it doesn't work, how could you capture at least 50%? And maybe I didn't do 50%, but what we did is, we looked at it that if we looked at a capture rate of 17 of the 35 total projects, that $55,000 per unit would get you to that. Now, it may not meet the criteria of the $1,500 per pound removal, but from a construction, from a cost perspective of getting the project to completion, the $55,000 would get us to the 50%. And what does 50% mean? In total quantity, it's 2,623 septic customers to get them on sewer. The total cost of those 17 projects we identified would be about $113 million. However, two of those 17 projects is $38 million in total, and a lot of that has to do with, again, the logistics to get it into our system. So we talk about options on how do we fully fund, how do we get these projects, how do we fund these projects? And I don't know if I was lucky enough to get this slide because I don't know if any idea is a good idea, but we have to talk about ideas of funding. We look at the partnership that Sorrel has, not just with Brevard County utilities, but any utilities, and is there a way to do more cost sharing? And again, the formula could be anything, but it's in general throwing out there. Option 2, and again, these are not by ranking, so please don't take it as such. I just had to throw them out there and such. We always try to look for Tallahassee, and not only Tallahassee, but DC, on how do we get state appropriation, how do we get federal appropriations. There's been some House bills that have been presented that obviously talk about a funding mechanism for projects like septic to sewer that could be used. And, as a utility director, I'm a big fan of that because the more funding, outside funding we can get for that, the softer the blow it is on everyone else. Option 3 is we look at, do we do a utility rate increase in order to bridge the gap? Now, I will say I've been working with Eden and her staff and looking at the legality, and we're still looking into that. But I just wanted to kind of convey that we are looking at that as not as a decision, but to find out if it is even an option. And then we're looking at, municipal service benefit units, or also known as some form of special assessment, where if existing funding is in place and there is a delta, can the area that's getting the benefit of that do a 10 or 20-year special assessment in order to supplement that cost? So in addition, we talked about the private, other opportunities of how we can partner with Sorrel. And, there's a common theme is, we identify that package plants are a source. Obviously, the Sorrel is looking at it from nitrogen reduction. Utilities is looking at it because, it gives us greater control, and we'd rather take over an asset that we feel down the line may come under our jurisdiction, and we'd rather get it in a place where it's still somewhat intact. We look at the our wastewater treatment plants. Right now, 11 of our 15 million gallon of our total flows are currently under AWT, and I know that phrase gets used a lot, but it's also called the 5531, which is all your discharge or all your effluent, treated effluent, has to be below 5 parts per million of suspended solids, 5 parts per million of biological oxygen demand, 3 parts per million of nitrogen, and 1 part per million of phosphorus. It's a stringent requirement. There's an investment in order to do that, to make sure you have the redundancy in order to assure that, because once you take on, once your plant takes on the designation of AWT, anytime we fall above those marks, even though it was below what our current level is, we would be out of compliance, and that's not our goal. So when we when we talk about the private package plants, on average, and again, we did this from a conceptual level, we looked at it that at a per unit cost, it would cost about $75,000 per unit of an area to convert the package plant and get them connected to our system. So, we talked about the $55,000 that we used as the 50% means with the septic tank. Well, to do a conversion, a ballpark conversion of what's the unit cost to do a conversion from package plant to our system, it's about $75,000.
Now, you're talking a whole unit.
So if I was like I'm just using this as an example. If I was a 40 parcel HOA in some remote area of Brevard County, and they were on a package plant, it would be $75,000 times the 40.
Okay.
And again, it's on average. But there is the cost to convert the plant to a lift station, and obviously the cost to take that from the location of the RAP and constructing a force main to the county system, and whether or not there's a cost associated with taking ownership of that existing package plant. So when we talk about AWT at a wastewater plant, the rule of thumb ballpark is that it costs about $8 to $10 per gallon to do this on a new facility. So I always use the 1 million gallon per day treatment plant. That cost would fall in the range of 8 to 10. Now, again, that's a planning budgetary number. When final bids came in, could it be somewhere in the range of 7? Possibly, but that's what we tend to use. Of our 50 million gallons per day that Brevard County Utilities treats every month, only 4 of those 4 million gallons per day does not meet AWT. And again, we've talked about the ability, the slide talking about the engineering study and the population projection analysis, and using partial Sorrel money in order to fund those projects. So we talk about ordinance opportunities, and you know, it's unfortunate, but sometimes if you don't have a rule, you can't make people do it. And so when we talk about discharge events, we talk about the mandatory hookup. Right now, the state statute only refers to gravity system. They don't make mention of low pressure system. And so, you know, that's a consideration. That can be done at the state level or possibly at a county level if the county chooses. We talk about the situation of what occurred in the smoke testing, and that even though a lateral has a crack identified or a cap missing, there is no mechanism in place in order for that resident required to fix it. And if they don't fix it, again, when we have rainy events, it becomes a point source that takes up our capacity during those events. You know, the one point I want to point out to you, and I want to make sure there's not a correlation made, is, you know, there was 10,100 homes that were affected by the smoke testing. And when you take into account the 40 that had caps identified as being, or 240 of the lateral caps missing, and the 30 that were identified, and if you do a percentage, it works out to like, I think, 3%. And the question that becomes to mind is, well, why are we doing a program? Why are we spending money? Because it's only 3% that's captured. But 3% is captured, but what's not captured is the volume of water that can enter that 3%. And I think that's the significance of what we're trying to identify. Fog ordinance, which is also referred to as a fats, oils, grease ordinance. This is really catered for commercial restaurants, and this is a means of developing a program and, you know, obviously the ability to inspect to assure that restaurants are disposing of their fats, oils, and grease by not putting it down our sewer. And why does that relate with this workshop is because it goes back to the capacity of our sewer lines. And this stuff, you know, fats, oils, grease, I don't know if you've ever deep fried a turkey in your life and you left the stuff laying there. You know, after it cools off, it gets really glumpy. Well, that glumpy stuff, and I don't know if that's a real word, but I used it, but that stuff is really that's what ends up getting in our sewers. It doesn't move with flow occurring, it just stays in there. And so again, it goes back to, it takes away from our capacity. So, and you know, just to give you an update, we've been working with Eden and our staff on developing that ordinance, and we hope to bring it to the commission somewhat soon. And we talked about conservation of reclaimed water. And, you know, again, we talk about an idea with two different perspectives. I think when Natural Resource looks at it, they look at it on the conservation part as it relates to nutrients, runoff into the canal. I look at it that right now we don't give reclaim away for free, but it's the best bang for your buck. As someone that lives in Vieira, I think it's like $6.43 a month for all the reuse you want. And so what from our intent, when you get into that use all you want, it takes away our ability as a utility to provide a proper level of service. We feel that if we bring reuse lines to any development, whether it's in the Vieira Suntree area, we do it in Port St. John, and, you know, Merritt Island and other locations, that we want to provide a service that we feel is accommodating or to a level of service that the residents should get. When you get into this take all you want, obviously the person that doesn't have their sprinklers turned on until 10 o'clock at night may not reap the benefit of that. So again, we talk about means of how do we discourage that, and, you know, the program of what the water management district occurs is meter it. Put a meter on everyone's house just like you have on your water. And so if you have a daughter that takes long showers like mine do, you take the repercussions when you get the monthly bill. So you take that into account with reclaimed water. If you obviously want to have that super green or overwatered grass, then there's a rate structure associated with that. good news is this is my last slide, I think. But, they always, once upon a time I had a mentor tell me, never leave a presentation and tell them what you don't want. So, but this isn't in any particular order, but, I think all of these are significant in some capacity. Us as a department, we have to continue with the sewer assessment lining. We recognize we have lines out there that were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s. We don't know what the workmanship of it was. We focus a lot on the material. Sometimes we don't know the workmanship, but the best way to get to the answer is let's go out there and let's assess them all and then develop a lining program to fix those. Smoke testing, it's from strictly identifying point source so that, unfortunately, when we get 4 or 5 inches of rain, we don't feel it when we get 1 or 2 inches. It's when we get to 4 or 5, but that's also when we also get the worst publicity. And so we want to minimize those events, and smoke testing helps us do that. Expanding our treatment plants to AWT. When we go through this analysis, whether we decide to stick with our current plant capacity that we have, or if we need to build a new plant and increase capacity, having that at AWT is favorable for a lot of perspectives, and I think as it relates to the Indian River Lagoon. Expand septic to sewer. We talk a lot about this. I think we need to look at that, not only again, I take the approach from a utility director. We need to look at it from a regional, not 40 lots. I know there's this criteria of, the 50 meter from a waterway. I look at it, if we're going to do 50 meter, let's go 150 meters and get them all in, because that way we can better plan on what that pipe should be. Continue with our R&R. I felt like I used preventative maintenance too much, so I had to be fancy and use R&R. That's remove and replacement. So, we focus a lot on the new, but we really have to keep in mind that the stuff that we have in place right now is we got to give it the love it needs. And connecting private wastewater plants to the county system. I don't want to oversell that, but like I said, I think that it's something to be considered. All right. I told you that was my last slide.
You guys have questions?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
So Eddie, you're saying that you need from us some kind of enforcement rule for leaking laterals?
I think there needs to be, yes, but you also have to remember that our utilities also go into incorporated cities. So, and again, I think it's an ordinance, it's interlocals that we need to be doing. Obviously we provide wastewater service for everything south of Bonita Beach side, so all of those incorporated cities. But yeah.
So we can work with the cities and hopefully they're on the same page as us and they would be willing to do that. Okay,
Yes.
So that's number one. Same thing with individual meters for reclaimed water. I think that's a great idea, because I can tell you that in Viera, we have an awful lot of people that have the lawns that, they count every blade and every blade is manicured, and if 10 gallons is good, 100 gallons is better.
I have neighbors like that.
And when we had the drought several years ago, they were all screaming at each other because, well, I'm only supposed to use my water, spray my water at 10 o'clock, but I have to get out there at 6 o'clock, else I don't get any water.
Correct.
So the meters would make a whole lot of sense, right? Mm-hmm. So what's the obstacle for us to do that? Because that's not cities necessarily, is it?
No, I mean, right now, most of our reuse system is in the county's jurisdiction. So we would have to obviously look at the funding in order to do so. I know the Water Management District, they promote metering for this, and we can look into that. So we can start that initiative and get back with you.
Okay, good. And the last thing brings me to rates. Are rates being adjusted upward to accommodate these increased needs of costs lift stations, assessments, and new lines and force mains? In other words, my question to you is, what have rates done over the last, say, 10 years versus where perhaps they should have gone to cover the cost of all these increases?
Well, I'm going to answer the question, but you can correct. So an adjustment was made in fiscal year 13-14 on the rates. Prior to that, there weren't adjustments, and obviously there was a shortfall that compounded over years because of that. The rates from what, and again, we're working on this and we're looking into the structure, but the basis of those rates that I understand were really to fix existing assets. It really wasn't catered for the expansion of system.
And two other points. One, we were supposed to have, and we dropped it out of the presentation, a rate comparison of where we were, because the county sewer rate is relatively low, and it's lower than a variety of other comparable jurisdictions or cities have. What Eddie was talking about is when that adjustment occurred, it was to cover that $135 to $150 million improvement program to do some pickup of capital, deferred capital maintenance that was needed. It also had built into it a built-in CPI, but that was really so that you'd have an ongoing continuum of what it was able to catch up on deferred maintenance to try to keep that on a par. A lot of the things that you're talking about today, that we're talking about today, are things that weren't contemplated there. For example, that, all the preventive maintenance stuff, the capacity issues that you're having, the upgrading to AWT, et cetera. None of that was contemplated, so those are all outstanding issues. The replacement of the force mains or the addition of force mains to provide other capacity. That's not included in what has been done. I mean, the board did significant improvements back in 13-14 through the present, and we're 6 years into the 10 years of the program, into the CPI. A lot of what you heard today are things that are additional or would go beyond. One from a utilities-only perspective, and then the other part is what's appropriate from a utility and/or Save Our Indian River Lagoon partnership perspective. And so I hope we've distinguished that for you, but there's both aspects.
If I could add, we had a 10-year plan for CIP improvements to fix deficiencies across the board in the utility system. It wasn't to fix everything, it was just to fix the things that were the most critical in that 10-year period of time. The rates would then continue, and we would have another 10-year period of time, and we would just be able to keep doing that. It was not intended to, as Frank was describing, it was not intended to introduce new programs or additional programs that weren't in existence or to be funded at that time. So the things that we're talking about here, as far as the new portions of them, that was not contemplated at all or considered at the time that we raised the rates in 2013. We had adjustments, we phased it in, we didn't do the adjustments all at once. We did that over a period of time. That's now completed, and now we're into the CPI adjustments only at this point.
So with what you were suggesting with the increased projections of more sewers being installed and created throughout the county, how do we pay for that? Will the rates of all those people that are new, the new ratepayers, will that cover the cost of the monies required?
That was the benefit of the slide with the 4 options, and how do we pay for it?
Okay.
Unlikely, I think, is the way I would answer. It's unlikely to do so.
Well, that's kind of what my supposition was, but I just wanted to...
If you bring on, for example, on a septic to sewer, if it's a remote location, it's got to be pumped a very long distance, long force main. That's a lot of maintenance work for the department to have to take into, and if it's only serving like 10 houses, probably the rates that they're paying aren't going to cover the cost of the maintenance of that entire system. On the other hand, if it's a cluster of maybe 200 houses, and it's a short distance, we can reach it, and those ones might cover the cost of the new maintenance requirements. So,
And the problem I see with what we're talking about here is with the septic to sewer conversion, an awful lot of what has been mandated is along the tributaries, the waterfronts. Well, they aren't customarily, as you said, 200-unit housing authorities. They're 20, 30 units, and then there's nothing else for another half mile, and then there's another 20 or 30 units. What are the projections on how you're going to fund that? Because obviously, they're not going to be enough units to pay. If they're going to pay a reasonable price, we're not going to come close to paying for it.
that's something we have to figure out, I think. We don't have the answers to all those questions, unfortunately. Not yet.
Thank you.
Along those lines, I'm thinking you're going to have to give us ideas of the projects you're talking about, because when I saw when I saw the $75,000 amount per unit, that's quite a big load for a homeowner to take on. So maybe we can look at some of those, and if you expand farther away from the lagoon, then maybe it can be a mix of an assessment and a mix of rate increase and a mix of SORO funds that we can do that. But you're going to have to come back and give us these projects, because I think they're all going to be individually
Correct.
having to be constructed. But I would be open to all of those, because I don't, if you're talking 20 or 30,000 and we could assess it over a period of time like we do in special districts, but I'm not sure a homeowner can afford that. And then again, I'm going to really count on your expertise that these are good projects to do above some of the other things that you guys have going on, like replacing those force mains to keep problems for all of the customers in a place where we're doing good for the Brevard County system.
And that's part of the reason why we're doing this projection analysis, because, I don't know, it's one of those things, if we knew of a vacant piece of land that was going to be a gold mine in 2 years, we'd buy it today. The idea of what we're trying to do is really get an idea, and roads are a good example. Sometimes they build a really big road in the middle of nowhere, and they say, why did they build a big road? And then 3-5 years later, everything's popping up. And so we're taking that approach to make those decisions and get back with you, but we're still in process with that.
Okay, and from the information that we've seen, Christine's got a good form right now, but we're way under the rest of the municipalities that sell water as far as rates. So I'm not against us catching the rates up a little bit also, so that you have more money coming in to really get this system running at a good rate. And if Brevard County is paying an average of $44.58 per month, and then you have Barefoot paying $67.80, Titusville $53.57, I don't think it's unresponsible for us to do that, especially when you said just 45 cents for a single-family home would get you $350,000
Right.
extra in revenue.
Right.
Because you're an enterprise fund, it's like if, I'm not going to say Chick-fil-A mixed with it, but if another company owned this, you're almost a business within the government. And so if you don't have enough money coming in to properly run your business, then you have to do small adjustments. So I'm in favor of looking at that, so that we're doing the appropriate thing, so that we're not having these spills into the lagoon, because I don't think that, well, it doesn't come out of general fund, it comes out of yours. So I think that's something we need to look at, because it's a business fund. So.
Okay, I'm going to go to public comments cards now, because we've got a bunch of those, and then we'll bring it back for further discussion. Maybe you'll learn something new that you want to ask from our public comments. D4, Sayukes? First name D4? Am I reading that wrong?
The four Sukes, I agree.
Okay, MJ Waters? I know that name. And after MJ, Jim Glass.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having this workshop. I think this is a really important topic. My name's MJ Waters. I've lived in Brevard County for over 35 years. I currently reside in Melbourne, Florida. And I just want to talk a minute about what my job used to be, which was to find unintended consequences of decisions that were being made at a corporate level. And the first thing I'd like to bring up is morphine. Because morphine was a great idea, because we had all these soldiers in World War I that had all these horrific accidents and injuries on the field, and morphine was able to relieve that pain. Well, then we found out morphine was addictive, so we found something extra, which was called heroin. And so that seemed like a great answer at the time. And nobody thought to say, what are the unintended consequences of this? I can remember when reclaimed water first came into being, because I was employed with a HOA community, and we thought this was just fabulous, until 9 years later, DEP came up and said, do you realize what your nitrogen levels are in this community? This is a big problem. And it was free, like we're saying here. Another great idea is let's keep our taxes at zero or low. Well, so what happens? We become known as the cheapest place to live in the country, and we get more people, and with those people we get more toilets, and we get our costs go up because we need more roads, we need more water. And so, okay, there's unintended consequences, and I think to Eddie's point, you know, for a while maybe some of those weren't thought about, but now we're seeing that coming into play. When FPL's costs go up, my bills go up. When my HOA costs go up, my bill goes up. I live in the county. Most others, I've seen the data, and most other cities have much lower costs, much higher costs for water and sewer than I have in the county. And I live in Vieira, where tons of people are moving in, and I think if we use the water and the resources, we need to pay for that. So I'm very much in favor of you looking seriously at increasing rates for those of us who use the product, because that's the way our marketplace works. And considering, from what I've seen, it looks like within 20 to 30 years, we're going to be bumping up against almost 1 million people in Brevard County. That's going to be a lot more stuff going into the lagoon than we have right now. And I think most of you know that I'm very passionate about fixing the lagoon, and I think we need to do that reasonably, and this can play a really good role in that. So thank you for this, and I hope you give it a lot of thought in terms of how we can move forward.
Thanks. Jim Glass?
Excuse me for wearing my shades, but I forgot to bring my glasses with me. I wear my hat.
Name and
I'm Jim
address,
Glass,
please.
and I live in Melbourne, a resident of the city of Melbourne, and I've lived in Brevard County for 19 years. I'm a retired civil engineer, worked with in the west coast of Florida with the counties over there and cities and water, wastewater, and stormwater projects. I'm familiar with these programs. I also worked with a lot of developers. And I read the impact fee ordinance, and I didn't see any money in the impact fees for water and wastewater. Is that right? Am I correct?
May I answer?
I didn't
yeah.
see. Okay,
No, there is. They're referred to as connection fees.
okay. But I'm talking about when you expand, like the Vieira sewage treatment plant.
We collect a connection.
You increase the capacity by 6 million gallons, I think it was.
Yes, sir.
Were there any fees collected to pay for the extra capacity that was added to that plant?
The fees are collected at the time that they submit for building permit per each home or per each property.
Okay. Well, what I'm getting at is that I work with a lot of developers that are in a piece of land where they have no sewer or water. The developer has to pay to put the sewer and the water in that development. So I hope that if you take the cost of expanding the Vieira plant by 6 million gallons, does that add 20,000 DUs? Is that what it was expanded to handle? Something like that?
I think so.
So, I'm just asking the question, did you get enough money to pay for that plant?
Yes, for the plant expansion at South Central, the calculation was based on, first of all, it's being funded through state revolving fund, and the debt service is tied in with the master projection related to the development, not only for Vieira, but any of the adjacent, I know there's some developments in Century, so yes.
Okay, so you are getting the money for that?
Yes, sir.
That's the first point I want to make. The other one, it strikes me that funding...
You have a minute.
Funding...
You have a minute left. I don't have a timer to show you, I'm just keeping
Okay.
track here.
Well, I just wanted to mention, the other thing I wanted to mention was about the dredging of canals. My daughter lives in Tortoise Island, and they're going to dredge their canals, and there are very wealthy homes out there. There are $1 million yachts sitting behind it, and I would ask you to just, maybe you could get the HOA to fund a part of the dredging of those canals, because the people that are benefiting from the dredging live in that subdivision. And they're very wealthy people, and I certainly think they could afford to pay something for that muck dredging. Anyway, those are 2 comments I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Lyndon Campbell,
What's the timer?
3 minutes. And I'll start after you give your name and address.
A couple points.
Name and address?
Pardon?
Name and address, please.
Lyndon Campbell, 5005 Fishtail Palm, Cocoa.
Thank you.
You said there was no enforcement for the laterals and the cleanouts. The health department has authority to take care of public health issues. A leaking sewer or an open vent is a public health issue. Couldn't you just say, we'll give you 60 or 90 days to fix it, and otherwise we have to turn it over to public health? I don't know. There is regulation. I've been fishing in the lagoon since the 70s, and it got to the point that I didn't even want to wade in it, and I'm real happy that finally there's some serious attention being given. It concerns me a little that it got to this point and that it's now being handled, to be blunt, big government. Here's my question. Since there seems to be a shift in society, Farmington, for example, is focused on a lot of green space and a whole different approach to housing. And there's permaculture, which has become a political movement, but it was about microagriculture. Fleet farms over in Orlando that I've mentioned. The term agri-hood is coming into use, and they're building them across the country. A food forest involves planting a bunch of different plants instead of making the golf course mentality that has existed in Florida, where you have a green carpet and a couple palm trees, a monoculture that is detested by nature, and it's not very effective at taking pollutants out. Couldn't we move and educate toward a whole different approach to how our environment is run? I know it's a big ask, but if there's a steady push in that direction, it would seem things would get better. That way, the plants act like sponges, and they will take up the stuff that you're trying to get rid of. The nitrogen, the phosphorus, they act as carbon sinks. And currently, people, to get the green grass, put a whole bunch of herbicide, pesticide, synthetic fertilizer, and that's what you're having trouble with. That's what you're paying tremendous amount. If instead of enforcing against plants growing, we go to slash and burn, they want it mowed and flat. Reverse what code enforcement does and try and get it so people grow plants, intentionally build, for example, native plant forests, and let them be the sink. It may save you quite a bit of money, and I think the public health would improve.
25 seconds.
Okay. They're dealing well with the point sources, the big ones, though we're still having hundreds of thousands coming out of Titusville each year in gallons of waste. If it was done through education like Fleet Farms, you could have at an individual level pollution control. So don't mow and clear, plant and cultivate.
Good timing. All right. Okay, Lisa Soto? Dr. Soto?
Good afternoon. Any chance I have to come and talk to you all, I love to take the opportunity to thank you for
Name and
being...
address, I'm sorry.
Lisa Soto, I'm the Executive Director of Marine Resources Council. We're in Palm Bay.
Awesome.
So I wanted to commend you again for being the great leaders that you are, for holding this workshop. Commend your incredible team that you have. Thank you for your presentations today. You know, you really do have a great team effort going on here between the staff in Natural Resources and Utilities, your Citizens Oversight Committee. They are considering and listening to the best available science. And I know you keep hearing that, best available science. And when it comes to adaptive management and dealing with the problems and the issues that we have here, we need the most recent information. That's why, you know, your team is working with the local scientists to gather data now. Once it gets into the peer-reviewed journals, it's been years. It's almost outdated already because it takes years to get published, it takes years to get those data. You have to go the peer review process. Yes, it's good and it's valid, but there's a process there that takes years. And sometimes you need decisions now. You need to be collecting data as you go along and adapting your progress, you know, with the information that you're collecting as you go. So the best available information is what's being collected by your team right now, that's being listened to every month by your Citizens Oversight Committee, who are investing their time and their energy and their thoughts, just like you are, in solving this problem. You need to continue to trust in that system and continue to, you know, value what they're doing. So I encourage you to, you know, stick with the plan, which is what I'm going to keep saying when I stand up here. And I agree with you, of course, Chairwoman, that the wastewater is a huge issue, and we need to invest in it. But I think, you know, Commissioner Pritchett, that your idea of increasing utility fees is the way to do it. You know, wastewater infrastructure and the service to our community is an ongoing service. It's going to go on long after, well, assuming that the Save Our Indian River Lagoon project funding is going to sunset. You know, we're still going to have to provide a service of wastewater infrastructure, hopefully improving, you know, well beyond advanced treatment to the innovative technologies that are coming, that are being used in other countries, you know, continuing to build this quality of service, continuing to be able to fund the great infrastructure needs that we're going to have long after we've solved the lagoon issue. So that's a different fund of money that needs to be continued, and the infrastructure tax or utility fees are the way to do that. So, you know, we would encourage you to proceed with, you know, increasing those utility fees to match the levels of the cities in Brevard County, or whatever the limitations are, to continue to increase those. So again, just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing. You've got a great team. You know, trust in them, and I'm here as a resource if you ever need us. Thank you.
Thank you. Lou Kontnick, and after Lou, David Botto.
Great. Great. Thank you very much. And thank the commissioners for being here, as well as the staff from the county. Lou Kontnick, and I live here in Melbourne. And I just want to express, as a voter who came at the time that the plan and the referendum was up for a vote, and I saw, well, look, they've got a draft plan, they've got a whole system, this seems sensible. And what I want to say is that, again, as a voter, I'm pleased with what has happened. The plan has been revised, the COC, supported by the staff, and I think maybe increasingly by the utility. We need the other utilities here as well. But you know, we've modified that plan. We've made different discoveries in terms of the impact of reuse water, in terms of a variety, the septics and the proximity, as well as the soil motility that really creates some as being more important. So basically, going back to my basic point, I think it's great that you've had this meeting. I hope that you, as the commissioners, have walked away with as much as I have. And really, I want to commend what I see as the stronger connection between the utility and the soil. And yeah, I think finding solutions like Commissioner Pritchett suggested, maybe on the conversions, but keep going. We're doing the right thing. Let's keep at it. We all want that water clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. David Botto, and after David, Laura Lee Thompson.
David Botto, Indian Harbor Beach. You may have heard some of my words before. I can only promise you'll probably hear them again. Congratulations to Virginia Barker and her team and everybody who's been working on this Save the Lagoon plan. It's great. Problem is, it doesn't address the root cause. The root cause is, of course, 5 decades of decisions made on land use, development, and construction without regard to its impact on the lagoon. Unfortunately, it appears we're continuing with business as usual, and that we are still not regarding impact on the lagoon in all our decisions as far as development. As you know better than I, development is accelerating now and will continue. The estimates of population growth in Brevard County from the University of Florida are staggering. The requests for density changes are pouring in. There is a program to solve this, and it's called low-impact development. And it's being done all over the country and actually all over the world, because we all have the same problem of population growth. There is a way to approach it. It's a no-brainer, really. The things you do are to retain the water. We're talking runoff, of course, to retain the water on the property, not put it into a storm sewers, to a storm drain system at all. Keep it on the property with in-yard swales, with in-yard percolation areas, rain gardens. Roof runoff must go either to a container, a cistern, or a rain barrel, or into a percolation area where it can either percolate into the ground or be evaporated. Permeable pavement. The technology is very advanced. There's permeable concrete, there's permeable asphalt, and there are permeable paving blocks that don't puddle at all. No runoff. It will all run into the ground. It's fairly cheap. It's easy. It relieves us from massive stormwater treatment. We must incorporate it in our permitting and in our zoning and in all our regulations. Both lagoon basin management action plans address this and require us to address stormwater management on the property, as well as reducing the runoff in all ways. It's in the BMAPs. Many counties in Florida have taken the concepts of low-impact development and incorporated it in a best management practices manual that can be used as a bridge as we convert our permitting and our zoning laws and our ordinances to accommodate low-impact management.
Thank you. Your time's up. I'm sorry. I'm sorry there's no warning here, but we have to keep track. And
I thank you for your time.
thank you so much. After Laura Lee, John Windsor.
Hi, Laura Lee Thompson, 3550 Irwin Avenue, Mims. And I too want to thank you guys for taking the time to have this workshop. I want to talk about fisheries, because reduction of nutrients going into the lagoon is one of the priorities of the Save Our Lagoon plan, but restoration of fisheries is also a priority. And I'm afraid that we're losing sight of fisheries as we argue about dredging and whether to take money away from dredging and quit dredging. Dredge holes are critical habitat for spawning fish, and also for fish that seek shelter in the deeper dredge holes when we have coal snaps. And 24 years ago, the public was led to believe that Florida's fisheries would improve if they had a net ban, and so 70% of the voters approved this net ban. And guess what? You know, our fisheries are still in decline. So taking the net fishermen off the water didn't help. when you look at the use of the dredge holes, like when fish are spawning, like spotted sea trout, drum, black drum, and red drum, they're out there on the flats, but when they spawn, they move into deeper areas that are adjacent to the grass flats. Well, first of all, we don't have any grass flats left anymore either, and part of that is due to muck being stirred up also. But by having these dredge holes full of muck, it reduces the dissolved oxygen for the fish, and then the fish eggs don't act right. Fish eggs don't hatch when they're buried in muck. So I want to encourage you as you're debating this, don't throw out the dredging and the fisheries, the need for the clean dredge holes for the fish. As you're talking about this, the best thing to do, in my opinion, is raise utility rates to a reasonable level so that we can do the fixes that we need there and let the Save Our Lagoon money be used for what the voters intended it for, which was projects that can't be covered by utility fees. Thank you.
Thank you. John Windsor, and after John, Claudia
Listopad.
Listopay.
Is it? Okay, just guessing. I didn't know too many Claudias. John Windsor, Melbourne, Florida. I've been watching the meetings in Tallahassee the last couple of weeks, and I feel like I want to stand up here and say a wave in support. But I'm not going to do that. Awesome staff. Everybody said that. It's incredible. The people, these four people over here, these folks over here, you have a great team working for you. Two comments specifically. One is, and you guys meet 3 times a month. We only meet, I'm on the Citizens Oversight Committee. We only meet once a month. You occasionally send challenges out to us at the meetings. Like 2 meetings ago, there was a suggestion that the Citizens Oversight Committee should come back at this meeting with a message. We haven't had a meeting yet, and we're in the sunshine. We can't talk to each other about anything you ask us to do, except at our meetings. So please give us enough time to address questions that you have. That's the first point. Second point is, this is really important, this workshop, but I see something's missing. And from the Lagoon perspective, and that's the municipalities that have wastewater treatment plants need to be part of this discussion for a bigger vision. Where are we going 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now? If we keep working as individuals, not working together, it's going to be more difficult to solve the problem. Thanks.
Thank you. Claudia Listopad, and after Claudia, Courtney Barker.
Hi, good afternoon. Claudia Listopad, President of Applied Ecology, Inc.
Address?
Thank you so much.
Address, please.
India Atlantic.
Thank you.
So I just want to bring a couple points. First of all, I want to thank you for your interest in having this workshop on restoring the lagoon. I know we are all dedicated. We are all in this together. I've been working since starting Applied Ecology for exactly 10 years, actually, in the lagoon. I've done a lot of sampling, a lot of modeling, and I'm really dedicated. I'm also a resident and want to see our lagoon restored. So a couple things I want to mention. One of them I want to emphasize that we really need to keep the course and keep the progress moving. Changing, and we have the annual updates, and the plan does allow us to be adaptive, but if we keep changing, it does present problems. One of the problems is it does slow down or even stop the progress on some of the projects that are being planned. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned, it does decrease the confidence of not only the taxpayers that funded this, but also the municipalities that, and I work with a lot of municipalities around the county that are planning their projects around being able to substitute those in the plan. So if they don't feel confident that the plan is going to be funding for a stormwater project 2 years down the road, they might simply skip doing that kind of plan and less gets done in the lagoon. So I think that's an important point to mention. Another one is we need to keep doing science. And I know science sometimes has a negative connotation, but we need the data to be able to adapt the plan. So let's change the plan when we have the data. And there's several studies. Some of these were presented here. They're preliminary. They haven't been finished yet. Let's get those studies to completion and use that data to adapt the plan for the 2020. Some of the key messages from those preliminary data points have been mentioned by Ms. Parker, but there's also a key point, is that these studies need to be done long-term. They need to look at seasonality. Seasonality has a huge impact in the sources of pollution. So sometimes in the dry versus the wet season, we might have different concentrations coming from different types of communities. So it's important to not just take one snapshot, do one sampling collection once, and make a lot of conclusions based on it. So data changes a lot. It also changes for space. So we shouldn't just use one community, one location, and make any kind of assumptions. We really need to study across the lagoon. So we saw that with the soils, how different the soils are. There's a lot of other variables that change spatially around our big watershed in the lagoon. So that's my recommendation. Let's keep doing the science. Let's keep the plan adaptive and use good science, long-term studies to make the right decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Courtney?
Good afternoon, Courtney Barker, City of Satellite Beach City Manager, Satellite Beach. So I wanted to talk about the idea of an ordinance for the lateral maintenance. Before Eddie got here, we were working with Jim on Satellite Beach actually drafting an ordinance as kind of like a pilot for that. But I think, when we're thinking about a countywide, I think it would be a really good countywide ordinance that the cities could either opt out or in, and I don't know if that's possible for a property maintenance issue, because, and I would be glad to, I know my city council hasn't discussed it as a group yet, but I would be glad to float it in front of them if that's something you all want us to look at, or even just bring the idea to the League of Cities to see if the cities would support it. But I think that's a good first step in getting the lateral issue, off the ground. With regard to, I think everybody talks about the staff. I couldn't agree more. They're great. The presentations they gave today were great. I read them, thoroughly before I came here, and I thought they didn't get a phone call from me. So. But I think in all of those recommendations, I think there's an opportunity both in rates and soil funds. I think there's a good ratio there and a balance that we could come up with to do both, to do all of those things. And so I, as a COC member, I'm real excited to see the utilities get involved, and I do think it would be a good thing to get the cities together in a workshop, on a staff level even, to talk about some of the upcoming projects that they might have. So I think we're in the, going down the right path, and I think you guys are doing a great job, so appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, do you guys have anything else you want to add? Commissioner Tobias? I had a couple questions. As far as that mandatory lateral thing, my concern, and obviously, and I've heard the argument made where, obviously you should have a responsibility. That's your property, and if you're polluting the lagoon, if you're affecting your neighbor on something else, then you should be responsible for that. My concern is perhaps somebody of low to fixed income. Now, one could argue if you have near beachfront property, I'm not talking about somebody who owns the $1 million mansion, I'm talking about the elderly person on a fixed income. If we mandate that they fix that pipe, they may not have the funds to do it. And I don't know how we create different situations for different people.
Yeah, and part is like Virginia had mentioned, I believe,
We have a
soil funding is an opportunity. It's a question, the 30 that were, that when they were contacted, soil funding was available, and yet only 3.
But we don't have a program in place that says that that's what we're going to do for every smoke testing we do in the future.
That would be part of the board's discussion, but I think there's a potential for opportunity for soil to be participating in that.
No.
Was it full funding?
Full funding, or up to 10,000. And,
Yeah.
we would consider more.
Because if you look at the impact, I'm not saying that someone deserves it more than, that was sort of my thinking on it initially, and I think you probably remember me saying that. How do you try to make different rates for different people? If it's affecting the lagoon, it's not like somebody goes in and says, I'm going to buy this property so I can get free lateral lines. That's about silly. But if it's polluting the water, it makes sense for us just to take care of it to make sure. But maybe that's part of the mandatory. I don't know how you force somebody to be allowed on their property, you know what I mean? But if we don't fix that problem, then it's all for naught. And I had a question for you, because you're probably following it a lot closer, but is Volusia County floating a tax now, too? Did I just read that somewhere?
Yes.
Yeah. And they used us as a reference, which I thought was pretty cool. You know, how, because someone said, well, Brevard needs to do it. And I'm like, and that was coming from somebody who lived in Brevard, which was a little bit disturbing, but I know, it's pretty sad. And another question about the dredging of canals. Someone brought up the Tortoise Island stuff. Is that an issue? Is that something we're paying for? Because I know that there's communities that self-assess for that stuff. Is that?
Right, so this was when the legislature approved $60 million for muck dredging in the county. This was one of the 5 sites selected for that funding. The legislative appropriations aren't fully funding that project, so Lagoon tax dollars are being used in concert with those state funds to complete the funding for that project.
And it does have impacts. It does have impacts. It's just like saying that you shouldn't do anything in Turkey Creek. I mean, when you know that it has impacts.
Right.
You know.
So one of the things is, you'll remember the board asked us to contract with ORCA, Ocean Research Conservation Association, to install 4 Kilroys. So we're going to locate 2 of them at the entrance canals to that Grand Canal system, so that we can measure how much of the nutrients that are diffusing out of that muck, how much of that is moving into the lagoon as storm events happen and stormwater's, pushing that water out of the canals into the lagoon proper.
Okay. All right, and Eddie, my question's for you next, too. As far as, obviously, we have a lot of issues. I mean, I'm not saying that our utility system's been completely ignored entirely, but as far as not just identifying where the problems are and trying to do the maintenance and trying to, talking about these hundreds and hundreds of miles of pipe we have all over the county in our system, I mean, wouldn't it make more sense, and even though the cost may be a little bit more initially, to increase that capacity now? Because we know the population's coming. It's just trying to guesstimate what that's going to be. But increase the capacity now and then slowly peck away, simultaneously peck away at some of the causes of the I&I. Some of the, what's wrong with the system, what needs to be relined, what bigger pipes do we need in certain areas. But at least if we've expanded capacity, we're not discharging. Because like as somebody said, we want to keep public support, and if our plan changes, we don't have the support, well, we lose complete support when we discharge into the lagoon. So say what you will and talk about it having a little impact. You talk about discharging, you want to see some angry people calling your office and leaving you nasty messages on social media and sending you emails. I mean, you want to keep the public involved, engaged, and supportive of the lagoon tax. We've got to do whatever we can to stop that discharge, and I think everybody wants to, without a doubt. But if increasing that capacity, at least in the short term, allows us to accept that extra capacity, which hopefully we can reduce over time. Do you get where I'm going? I mean, it sounds like a simple solution, but at the same time, it makes sense.
And I think we already do that. I mean, I always say we don't build the watch. So when we design lines, we do have some excess, because we recognize that, only in a perfect world it would be a tight system and there would be no stormwater going into it. So we do take it into account for that. It's just, it becomes the measure of cost. If I say the calculation is 24-inch and I size it to a 30, I could make it a 42, and it's to what magnitude we oversize.
But I believe we had a plant that took over double them, or maybe 5 million more than what it was supposed to.
Right.
So obviously that plant's not a capacity. Like maybe we need to hit those areas
you're
that
talking
are.
about plants, and you're talking about the lines.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. I know, but I'm saying if you increase the capacity,
plants.
then you address what
Right.
causes that capacity.
Right.
Because the most stark difference between, like, not even that old of systems, but older systems compared to what Vieira is pumping through, the amount is staggering when it's like double, and the amount of gallons that they push through compared to, and that's new development, when most of those families are larger families than some of the older homes. So that to me was pretty eye-opening. So I know there's problems in the system, but I just want to at least do everything we can now we got to keep everybody on board. We want everybody to support the program, and until and we may disagree entirely, no, we don't disagree entirely on getting there. I just think that maybe funding, and I think that there's a good combination possibly of both. If we've not been increasing rates at all, then we need to look at CPI, and we need to look at things that are reasonable. But all of us in Brevard County pay this tax too. So that's an argument that's been made to me, and I would make that same argument, that we're all paying the lagoon tax as well. So if we're not going to seek the benefit of it and do things that prevent that discharge into the water, that create the muck, then, I mean, it is the utility too, but I don't think that it should just be the ratepayers. I think there's enough money to address both. And I think that there's a good balance between the two, instead of just making the ratepayers pay it, because we're already paying the tax.
Right.
So, sure.
I agree with you, except that people that have, say in Titusville, they're paying their rates. They're also paying lagoon tax. Why should their lagoon tax be going to fix units, sewer, whatever, in Satellite Beach or Indian Harbor Beach? So that argument is being made as well. And the other argument that I hear a lot, and I agree with, is that if we take lagoon tax money to fix sewer systems. Sewer systems are paid by ratepayers. They're going to continue to be funded ad infinitum in the 12th year, 20th year. The lagoon tax is only available for 10 years. That's a finite amount of money. So if you start siphoning that money off to fix sewer systems,
But obviously, commissions, and you've been on there for 4 years too, commissions have failed to keep up the system. So now we're left with trying to get us to where we're at an acceptable level. So I'm not saying that we take, even half of that lagoon money. What I'm saying is we need to take some of it. In my opinion, we should take some of it. Because the person in Titusville is still using the lagoon, is still benefiting from the lagoon, and is still, obviously, we've included them in the tax because they're part of the county, but they're still reaping the benefits of an improved lagoon.
Yeah, but on that note, Titusville's paying $9 more for water.
To their municipality.
Because
right.
they've started lining their pipes, adding capacity, whereas Brevard County citizens, we have, granted, it might be the ones in the past, but everybody's enjoying a whole lot less in payment.
Right.
So if you make the whole county double pay that, I don't know that becomes, I agree with you, we need to fix it, so in agreement with you. But I don't know if that's a fair tax, unless we take and we go ahead and give every water system the same proportional amount of money. Now, that would be fair. So that would be something that I could understand. But
Madam Chair, quick question for Virginia Barker. Did Titusville just get an $8 million Sorrel project for their water treatment facility?
It was
so to be very clear, yes, they're paying, but they're also getting benefits as well.
It was for the reclaimed water, though. It wasn't for a new water system or to change capacity, Commissioner Tobias. And for all the proportion through all the districts, they're still under the amount of money that's going to the North Brevard district compared to the other 4 districts, which is fine because most of the problems are in the Banana River area and stuff, so that's good. But that wasn't to expand a capacity situation, which again, I agree with you, we need to fix it, and if we divided that across so that everybody's getting that same amount, if all 5 districts are paying into this, then it really needs to benefit all 5 districts, as a fair tax that way. And if we start using, I don't know, I have a little heartburn with it, but I understand we got to clean the lagoon up. But if we start concentrating on certain areas, then maybe what we should do is get rid of the lagoon tax and then just change the rate structures and have people really paying for what they're using. Just a thought. If we start using it for things that enterprise funds use the money for. But again, I hear you, Commissioner Isnardi, and maybe there's a way that we can get there.
I don't know where Mr. Lober is, so I don't know if he has anything he wants to ask. I would just be interested in looking at some of your priorities as far as, you said you had 32 projects, and, you looked at what is included. I'd like to see a bigger breakdown.
Sure.
If that's possible.
Sure.
And believe me, I'm not suggesting we revamp the plan. I like some of the changes that have been made to the plan to address the septic because we don't, I mean, I don't, we take samplings of all the septic and, you know, here and there, but we can't get underneath that septic system to know what leaching is. We don't often talk about groundwater. I had no idea reclamation water was that toxic. I mean, I wouldn't have thought it myself. I mean, is there a way that they can put in a system to treat some of that or to remove some of those nutrients?
Well, that's what the Titusville example is doing, is we are upgrading treatment in the plant so that the reclaimed water will be much cleaner.
But that's
We're
their
doing the same thing
water.
at the Palm Bay plant. We're doing same thing or similar thing in.
But that's their reclaimed water. I'm talking about like big subs
Yeah.
and
Sorry.
big subdivisions, big, you know, big areas that have all of that retention.
So the reclaimed water, right, comes out of the plant.
Right.
And then it goes through distribution lines back to the communities.
Yes.
So while it's at the plant, we want to scrub it before it gets distributed back out for irrigation. Is that?
Right. But I mean, but everything that they're taking in, is there a way, I mean, is it how it's being collected? I mean, other than the baffle boxes, is there?
No.
Yeah.
No, it's the only way to do the reduction is at the treatment process.
Okay.
One of the problems at the subdivisions level with the reuse water is the overwatering, so to the point where the ground is saturated, the water now just runs off and runs into a retention area. If it's a new subdivision, if it's an old one that doesn't have retention, it goes right into the discharge, wherever that discharge goes. And so those nutrients, just from the water itself, goes straight out. In addition to that, the water that soaks into the ground does so at a rate that exceeds the grass's ability to soak up the nutrients, so to speak, to uptake the nitrogen and phosphorus. And so it goes into the groundwater, gets below where the plants can get to it, and works towards the lagoon, just the same way that a septic system does. And so depending on the proximity to where the treatment plant is to a discharge or the lagoon, it's going to get into the surface water eventually. And so the idea is to get the reuse water clean enough to where at least the part that it doesn't have too much for the plants to uptake, so if it even goes down into the groundwater, we're not having a problem there. If they overwater, then that's another problem. But that gets back to the metering idea and, you know, discouraging the excessive use of the water in the first place.
And I think I finally understand your question. I'm sorry, I missed it the first time. So part of that reclaimed water turns into stormwater runoff, and part of it soaks into the groundwater where it becomes a groundwater problem. So the only way to address the groundwater problem is at the plant. The stormwater runoff we could address through, you know, stormwater projects will help. Not so much baffle box projects that focus on the sediments rather than the dissolved nutrients, but stormwater ponds, swales, other stormwater BMPs will help.
But to be clear,
But they cost more than
if
the
you-
improvements at the wastewater treatment plant.
if you can motivate a customer or user of reuse water to use it appropriately to start out with, then you're not putting it into the stormwater in the first place, and so you don't then have to clean it up.
I think it's going to be a hard sell.
It's
Putting
gonna
a
be
meter,
difficult.
putting a meter on reclaimed water that isn't supposed to cost anything, and trying to educate people enough to explain what it is, and justifying, well, why are you collecting money from me? What are you going to do with that specific pot of money? And how are you going to, in turn, how do you even measure that? I mean,
Well, this is part of why we continue to go forward with the baffle boxes and other options that we have
Right.
to put in the advanced biological systems that we're using now to pull water out of a ditch, run it through a biological system, and then let it go back into the ditch. And we're removing the nutrients that way from the water after it's already in there, regardless whether it came from used water or septic system or some other source, fertilizer, wherever it came from. We're still doing all of those things because you know, it's a multifaceted problem, and it's going to require a multifaceted solution. And in some areas, they're going to respond better to certain types of approaches, and then others will work better with some other type. And so we're learning more and more. They're measuring it. Every time I find out about more of the things they're measuring, I'm impressed. It's hard for me to figure out where we can make super obvious improvements in what we're trying to do. Clearly, there's a huge problem, and it's going to take a lot.
I think I cringe every time I see somebody blowing grass into the street or into a ditch.
Absolutely.
It makes me want to pull over my car, but probably not a good idea.
I'm encouraged by what I see. I live on a canal, and I can tell you, I almost never see anybody using their blower, blowing their clippings right into the canal deliberately. When I was a kid, that same canal, when I was a kid, you'd see rafts of grass clippings floating by because they literally dumped it into the canal because there was no curbside pickup or anything of that sort at that time. And so we've come a long way, but we've got the legacy muck that's in that. I speak about my canal. It used to be 14 feet deep. It's about 6 feet deep now. And so there's a lot of years of legacy in there. And while people are doing a little better, I think, there's a long history of a problem that needs to be dealt with.
And I think I asked this before, like a long time ago, but I still get people asking me about street sweeping. I mean, it seems like something very inexpensive that we could do, and if it helps some, or maybe as a trial, I mean, just to see what kind of...
Right. So when the stormwater fee increase was adopted in 2014, one of the promises made with that was to expand street sweeping. And so we are sweeping every curbed lane quarterly now in unincorporated county.
Hey, do you see a big return on that? I mean, do you?
It's hard to we're collecting a lot of material that would otherwise be making it into baffle boxes or out to the lagoon. We can't measure a reduced load in the lagoon.
Oh, yeah, I didn't expect that. I was just wondering what you were collecting. I mean, is this something we should be doing more of?
Collecting tons and tons of material.
Street sweeping has a direct benefit to baffle boxes in that it allows, it intercepts a lot of material before it gets into the baffle box, which allows the baffle box to function better for a longer period of time. They can only function well up to a certain amount of capacity of getting full of material, and they have to be pumped out themselves.
Well, you see grass and stuff going right into the stormwater, too, and that's something I know that, I don't know. I get asked that question more often than you would think. All right, so Eddie, get me that list.
I will.
If you could.
I will.
Quick aside on meters, and when I was in the legislature, Florida Power and Light, you probably recall, I do, the meters went, one way, and they weren't digital, they were analog, and the legislature allowed Florida Power and Light to go to quote-unquote smart meters. Smart meters are one that could be read where the individual doesn't have to come onto your property, read what it was last time. I thought it was a great idea, as did the legislature. I think it passed unanimously. You need a public record request, my office, to see how many emails we got from constituents that believed that we were monitoring their power usage on an hourly basis instead of and that was just a change of one box to another that was digital instead of, so to add one, it may sound like a great idea, but just be aware the number of calls that you will get that big government, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, people that have never voted, never contacted, the fact that Big Brother is monitoring them, you will be absolutely astounded. So I'm not...
People get free water for grass, and they want their grass this high so then they can mow it and fertilize it, so they have to mow it more often.
I'm not arguing the efficacy. I'm just be prepared to pick up your phone. Okay.
Now you're telling me I got to pay to make my grass grow fast so I can mow it more.
Oh no, that's the least. No. That's the least of the issues. Is the money will not. I don't think the money will be it. The fact that you're monitoring water consumption will be the big issue. Just be prepared for it. Just be prepared.
People don't like changes.
I agree with it. Perfect.
Anything else? That's good. All right, nothing else?
Yeah, before you, I mean, we're going to have other business, because I do have a couple items I got to bring up before the board.
Other business then.
Right.
I didn't see that on there.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to highlight it for you. I think the three quick issues. One, we were contacted today by Patrick Air Force Base. They are in the process of applying for a program to the Department of Defense for a star-based program, which has been in existence for a while, but they're applying now, which is really to, in partnership with the school board, starting at the 5th grade level, have a program in place to encourage Title I, it's primarily with Title I schools, to have a program at Patrick where the kids from Title I would go there for either a full week or 1 week, 1 day a week for a month. What they'd like for us is to show community support, so they asked if we could have the commission sign a letter, which I prepared, and I'll give you a copy. There's a PowerPoint for the STEM program that kids would participate in. EDC, the school board, they've already signed those letters. It's urgent because I think they are planning to submit this tomorrow. So I do have a copy here if we could get everyone to sign it, if the board approves it. If you'll sign this one copy, and that would be great. I don't know if we need a motion and a second to do
I
that.
make a motion to approve.
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner Pritchett, a second by Commissioner Smith. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes 4-0.
A second quick item. It's come to our attention that the school board has scheduled their final budget hearing on September 10th, which is the same day that we have for the board's tentative budget hearing, that we had initially scheduled that. According to Florida Statute 200.065 and trim requirements, the school board has first priority on hearing dates, and we can't schedule that budget hearing on the same day the school board has their hearing schedule for. We usually have been successful in not having that, but this time that has occurred. So I am requesting permission to reschedule the tentative budget hearing that was for Tuesday, September 10th to Thursday, September 12th at 5 p.m. This will meet the statutory timeline for holding the tentative hearing within 65 to 80 days of the certification of the taxable value, and then we'll advertise the final budget hearing for that following Friday, and we'll hold the final budget hearing on September 24th as initially scheduled. So I'm looking for a motion and board approval to move the first one from September 10th to September 12th.
Make a motion to move it.
Motion to move the meeting from September 10th to September 12th by Commissioner Pritchett.
Second.
Second by Commissioner Smith. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes 4-0.
And then I'm going to give you one last very quick update. I have met with Rockledge. I think we're going to have an agreement coming back on the CRA. I met with them a couple of times. I think they're going to bring it before their council, and then I think that'll work out well. I think the board will be happy with it. For the interlocal agreement, I'm waiting back from Cocoa, and we've met with them as well, and I think they're moving forward. So that good news on those two fronts. We're also talking with the City of Melbourne on the O'Galley one for something that relates to what we were talking today. Virginia mentioned it, the potential project that may be stormwater related for the Lagoon. So that'll be something we might be able to bring back to the board. And then there's the last one would be the City of Palm Bay. I do believe they're going to the City Council on something at the next board meeting. I just got that, the next council meeting. I just got some information on it yesterday. I don't understand it fully because it talks about potentially extending the CRA, which is nothing we've discussed, and I went through the notes of the last meeting, where you extended it and gave them to the end of the year. But
I didn't extend the CRA.
No, I understand. That's why I'm mentioning it now, because
And to give you just a little background on that, because they have, I guess what concerned them was they didn't understand what their big planner developer down there that's doing a whole bunch of whole bunch of projects there, was concerned because they didn't know what the interlocal agreement would mean. They didn't know if it would interfere with what the city of Palm Bay was doing. So initially, the thought by city management and possibly council, but the direction was that give us a little more time, and that way we won't scare the developers away from finishing some other projects they wanted to do. Well, turns out they came and asked for an appointment in my office last week. They're more concerned by the unknown, so they're more than happy if we move ahead with it. But I made it very clear where the county's position has been with the CRA's transparency, not extending it, not taking out bonds, so they know where we stand, at least for where we've been with the other ones.
And I think that's consistent with what I heard at the
But
last
I'm not
meeting. That's why I'm
negotiating,
bringing it.
yeah, I'm not negotiating with
No,
their
no, I get it.
developer.
I
What I'm
understand.
saying is, so if that extension goes before their board, I mean, I don't know what other message we could possibly give to say that we won't probably be likely to support such a thing, so.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure the board was aware of it, because I think what you've now said is consistent with what we heard at that prior meeting. We want to just make sure the board was aware of it.
Right.
Thank you. That's it.
That's it. All right, with that, I guess we'll adjourn.
The opinions expressed by any member of the public during any period of public comment do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, or the program sponsor, and are solely those of the presenter. The Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, and the program sponsor hereby expressly disclaim any and all responsibility or liability for any defamatory or slanderous statements expressed by any member of the public during any such period.